1991. Fall asleep to hilarious history, The Electric Frontier, by Mark Twain. Copyright 2026, James Henderson. Chapter 1. The First Nintendo War. I have often observed that the more civilized a man becomes, the more effort he puts into killing his fellow man from a comfortable distance. In my day, if you intended to settle a grievance with a neighbor, you generally had to trudge through a fair amount of mud, look the fellow in the eye, and perhaps catch a cold for your trouble. It was a personal, soggy, and thoroughly unpleasant business. But by the time January of 1991 rolled around, humanity had finally achieved its greatest ambition. We had turned the apocalypse into a primetime television event. I sat before the glowing glass altar, what the locals call a television, and watched the world turn a peculiar shade of electric lime. They called it Operation Desert Storm, but to my eye, it looked more like a midnight raid on a haunted aquarium. The entire war was presented in a sickly, green-tinted night vision that made the generals look like Martians and the explosions look like spilled ginger ale. It was a Nintendo war, the pundit said, though I suspect the average 10-year-old with a controller in his hand had a better grasp of the logistics than the politicians did. The year began with a gentleman named Saddam Hussein, a man whose mustache was so impressively villainous it looked as though it had been borrowed from a Victorian stage play, deciding that Kuwait was not so much a sovereign nation as it was a spare room he'd like to occupy. The rest of the world, led by a President Bush, who spoke in a rhythmic, stuttering prose that suggested he was reading his own autobiography through a kaleidoscope, decided otherwise. And so we were treated to the first truly live war. In 1861, if you wanted to know how a battle was going, you waited 3 days for a telegram and another week for a newspaper that was mostly lies and advertisements for liver pills. In 1991, you simply sat on your velvet sofa with a bowl of puffed corn and watched Bernard Shaw hide under a table in Baghdad. It was a marvel of the modern age. You could witness the fall of an empire without ever having to put on your trousers. The intelligence of iron. What struck me most was the introduction of the smart bomb. I was told these were bombs that possessed a certain degree of education, missiles that had graduated from the finest technical institutes and could find their way down a specific chimney with the grace of a deadly Santa Claus. Now, I have spent a fair portion of my life on the Mississippi, and I can tell you that navigating a steamboat through a shifting sandbar requires a great deal of intuition, sweat, and profanity. To see a hunk of metal fly 300 miles and decide on its own which particular window it would like to enter is both a triumph of science and a terrifying indictment of our priorities. We have spent billions of dollars teaching rocks how to think, and the first thing they think about is where to explode. I watched the footage, grainy black and white images from the nose cam of a missile. It was a strange voyeuristic sensation to see the world from the perspective of a falling object. You watch the target get closer and closer, the crosshair steady as a surgeon's hand, and then static. The missile dies, the screen goes blank, and the news anchor returns to tell you about the weather. There is a certain sanitized cruelty to it. In my century, death was accompanied by smoke, screams, and the smell of sulfur. In 1991, death was simply a momentary interruption in the broadcast. The theater of the desert, The landscape of the conflict was a vast, shimmering desert, a place where the sun is less a celestial body and more a personal insult. General Norman Schwarzkopf, a man built like a brick smokehouse and possessing a temperament to match, became the star of the show. Stormin' Norman, they called him. He stood before maps that looked like a game of billiards and explained the left hook with the enthusiasm of a man describing his favorite fishing hole. It was a masterpiece of marketing. The war had its own theme music, its own graphic design, and its own scheduled commercial breaks. I couldn't help but feel that we were losing the history of the thing in favor of the production. We were no longer a global community concerned with the complexities of Middle Eastern borders. We were an audience waiting for the next season of the sands of our lives. Every night, the Scud and the Patriot engaged in a high-stakes duel in the clouds. The Scud, a Soviet-made relic, was a clumsy, drunken missile that tended to wobble through the air like a duck with a vestibular disorder. The Patriot was the sophisticated American answer, a missile designed to intercept the Scud. Watching them meet in the night sky was like watching a very expensive fireworks display where the tickets cost $1 billion apiece and the losers didn't get a refund. The living room general. The most curious development of 1991, however, was the CNN effect. For the first time, the leaders of the world were getting their intelligence from the same source as the man sitting in his pajamas in Des Moines. If a bomb fell in Baghdad, the president and the plumber found out about it at the exact same moment. This led to a peculiar kind of global anxiety. We were constantly plugged in, a term that suggests we are all just appliances waiting for a surge of electricity. We sat in the dark, bathed in the blue light of the tube, watching the electronic frontier expand. We were told that this was a new world order, a cleaner, faster, more efficient way of being. But as I watched the green-tinted shadows and the smart machines doing our dirty work, I couldn't help but wonder if we were merely becoming more detached from the consequences of our own nature. We had made war so high-tech, so Nintendo, that we risked forgetting that underneath the night vision and the hyperlinks, there was still a man in a hole wondering why the sky was falling. By the time the 100-hour war ended, a conflict so brief it barely outlasted a decent head of cabbage, the victory parades began. We celebrated the efficiency of our machines and the brilliance of our screens. We had conquered the desert with fiber optics and pixels. But even as the Nintendo war faded into the credits, I felt a lingering suspicion. We had settled the electric frontier, yes. We had proven that we could see in the dark and throw rocks with an Ivy League education. But as I turned off the glowing box and sat in the sudden, heavy silence of my room, I realized that for all our smart bombs, we hadn't yet figured out how to make a smart peace. 1991 was only just beginning, and the maps were already dissolving. The Soviet Union was shivering in the wings. A young man in a flannel shirt was tuning his guitar in Seattle, and a fellow named Tim Berners-Lee was about to hand us the keys to a digital labyrinth from which we might never emerge. The green glow of the night vision was gone, but the world was still squinting, trying to see what was coming next, and I, Mark Twain, was left to wonder if the 21st century was going to be a grand adventure or just a very long, very expensive commercial for a future we weren't quite ready to buy. Chapter 2, The Scud and the Patriot. It has been said that the history of human progress is merely the history of man finding more expensive ways to throw rocks at his neighbor. In the beginning, we used our hands, then we used slings. Eventually, we graduated to catapults and cannons. By 1991, we had reached the absolute summit of this particular brand of idiocy. We had finally taught the rocks how to think, how to fly, and, most importantly, how to cost more than a mid-sized cathedral. This brings us to the peculiar aerial ballet of the Scud and the Patriot. It was a nightly performance that dominated the airwaves, a high-stakes duel in the stratosphere that served as the primary entertainment for a world huddled in its pajamas, watching the sky through the neon green tint of a television screen. The Scud, the flying chimney. First, let us consider the Scud. The very name, Scud, sounds like something you'd find at the bottom of a stagnant pond, or perhaps a particularly stubborn bit of grime in a coal miner's bathtub. It is not a name that inspires majesty. The Scud was a Soviet-made relic, a long iron cylinder that looked less like a weapon of the future and more like a Victorian chimney that had suddenly developed an ambition to see the world. In the hands of Saddam Hussein, the Scud was used as a sort of psychological blackjack. It was a clumsy, drunken beast of a missile. It had no brain to speak of. Once launched, it lumbered through the air with all the grace of a grand piano falling down a flight of stairs. It didn't much care where it landed, which made it terrifying in a very specific, haphazard way. It was a weapon of to whom it may concern. If you were a resident of Tel Aviv or Riyadh in early 1991, the arrival of a Scud was announced by a siren that sounded like the groan of a dying giant. You then had roughly 2 minutes to find a room, seal the door with masking tape, as if Scotch tape were a reliable defense against the chemical end of days, and put on a gas mask that made you look like an oversized, panicked insect. I have seen many fashions in my time, from the hoop skirt to the top hat, but I can say with some authority that the gas mask is the least flattering accessory ever devised by the hand of man. It levels all social distinctions. A duke and a dustman look equally ridiculous when they are breathing through a rubber snout and trying to explain to their children that everything is perfectly normal while the house shakes. The Patriot, the Rhodes Scholar of Missiles. To counter this flying iron pipe, the Americans introduced the Patriot missile. If the Scud was a blunt instrument, the Patriot was a surgical scalpel, or at least that was how the brochure described it. The Patriot was a smart missile. It had been to school. It had a computer for a heart and a radar for an eye. It was designed to do the impossible, to intercept an incoming Scud and blow it into confetti before it could reach the ground. Military men, who have a natural gift for turning a cataclysm into a mathematical equation, describe the Patriot's task as hitting a bullet with a bullet. Now, I have spent a fair amount of time around firearms, and I can tell you that hitting a stationary barn from 20 paces is an achievement for some men. The idea of 2 metal cylinders traveling at several times the speed of sound, meeting in the dark over a crowded city, is the sort of thing that would make a gambler weep and a physicist retire. The cost of this bullet-on-bullet encounter was also something to behold. Each Patriot missile cost somewhere in the neighborhood of $1 million. The Scud, being a piece of surplus Soviet plumbing, cost about as much as a used Buick. We were essentially throwing bags of gold at bags of garbage, hoping they would collide in midair. It was the most expensive fireworks display in the history of the species, and the world watched it every night on CNN with the rapt attention of a child watching a puppet show. The spectacle of the sky. The television, that flickering blue idol of the 90s, turned the Scud Patriot duel into a spectator sport. We would watch the dark sky over Riyadh, and suddenly a streak of light would ascend, the Patriot rising like a vengeful soul. Then a flash, a muffled boom through the speaker, and the news anchor would announce a successful intercept. We cheered. We felt the thrill of technological superiority. We were the people of the future, protected by our intelligent rocks. However, as is often the case with the official version of things, the reality was a bit more complicated. It turns out that when you blow up a missile in midair, the pieces don't simply vanish into the ether. They obey the laws of gravity, which are much older and much more reliable than the laws of the Pentagon. A successful intercept often meant that instead of one large missile hitting a building, a dozen flaming chunks of metal, one of which was a $1 million American computer, hit the building instead. It was a bit like stopping a burglar by throwing a grand piano at him. You might stop the crime, but you're still going to need a new porch. The masking tape defense. But the true comedy, if one can find comedy in the shadow of annihilation, was the human reaction. We are a resilient and ridiculous species. In Israel, families sat in sealed rooms with their gas masks on, playing board games and eating snacks. There is something profoundly human about trying to land on Park Place while a Soviet-era rocket is wobbling toward your zip code. We were told that if the Scuds carried chemical weapons, a bit of plastic sheeting and some masking tape would save us. It is a testament to our capacity for hope that we actually believed this. We assumed that the most horrific nerve agents ever devised by the science would be thwarted by the same stuff I used to wrap my Christmas presents. It gave the civilians something to do, I suppose. There is nothing like a household chore to keep a man from dwelling on the fact that he is currently a target in a 16-bit video game played by generals. The verdict of the high-tech rock. As the weeks wore on, the smart war began to look a little less smart and a little more like the same old mess, just with better lighting. We realized that for all our gadgets and our radar and our $1 million interceptors, we were still just people hiding in holes, terrified of the things falling from the sky. The Patriot missile became a symbol of the age, an expensive, sophisticated, highly marketed solution that worked perfectly in the laboratory and about half the time in the real world. It was the ultimate 1991 product. It was flashy, it was televised, and it promised a level of safety that the world simply isn't equipped to provide. By the time the Scud stopped flying, we had convinced ourselves that we had entered a new era where technology had mastered the chaos of war. We believed that the smart era had arrived. But as I watched the smoke clear over the desert, I couldn't help but think of a story I once heard about a man who invented a smart umbrella that could predict when it was going to rain. It was a marvel of engineering, full of sensors and dials. One day, he stepped outside, and the umbrella told him it was perfectly dry. A moment later, he was soaked to the bone by a sudden downpour. He stood there, dripping wet, staring at his expensive dry umbrella, and realized that the machine wasn't wrong. The rain was just unauthorized. The Scud and the Patriot were the unauthorized rain and the smart umbrella of 1991. We had taught the rocks to think, but we hadn't yet taught them how to be kind. We were still throwing stones. We had just found a way to make the stones provide their own commentary for the evening news. And so, as the duel in the desert sky faded, we prepared for the next great folding of the map. The Soviet Union was crumbling, and soon we wouldn't even have the luxury of a predictable villain with a recognizable mustache. The world was becoming a place where the enemies were invisible and the connections were made of light. We were leaving the age of the chimney and entering the age of the ghost. But for those few months in early 91, we were all just children in gas masks, watching the million-dollar stars collide and praying that the masking tape would hold. Chapter 3. The Hammer and Sickle Lowered. For 40-odd years, the world lived in a state of perpetual twitchiness, much like a man sitting in a room filled with gunpowder while his roommate insists on practicing his trick shot with a flaming torch. We called it the Cold War, a term that always struck me as a bit of a misnomer. It wasn't so much cold as it was frozen in a state of mutual homicidal politeness. We expected the end to come with a spectacular earth-shattering kaboom that would leave the planet looking like a charred brisket. Instead, in the year of our Lord 1991, the great Soviet Empire, the evil empire, if you were a fan of Mr. Reagan's cinematic prose, didn't go out with a bang. It went out with the scratching of a few pens, a televised resignation, and the quiet realization that the landlord had finally run out of other people's money. The grand experiment's final bill. The Soviet Union was what I like to call a grand experiment, which is a polite way of describing a situation where you try to fly a lead airplane by sheer force of political will. It was founded on the idea that if you simply told everyone to be equal, they would happily ignore the fact that some people are naturally more inclined to work than others, and that everyone, without exception, is inclined to want a better pair of boots than their neighbor. By 1991, the experiment had reached the stage where the lab equipment was rusted. The scientists hadn't been paid since the previous October, and the test subjects were primarily interested in finding out what a Big Mac tasted like. Communism, it turns out, is a wonderful philosophy if you happen to be a beehive. But for human beings who possess the inconvenient habit of having individual souls and appetites, it was a bit like trying to fit an elephant into a waistcoat designed for a squirrel. The Gang of Eight and the Pickle Jar Coup. The beginning of the end arrived in August, while the rest of the world was busy trying to figure out if their new cellular phones could actually make a call from a moving vehicle. A group of hardline communists, men whose faces had all the warmth and flexibility of a wet sidewalk, decided they had seen enough of Mikhail Gorbachev's reforms. They called themselves the State Committee on the State of Emergency, a name that sounded like a bureaucratic stutter. These Gang of Eight fellows attempted a coup. Now, a coup d'etat should be a sharp, decisive affair, a lightning strike of military precision. This, however, was more of a coup d'idiocy. They appeared on television looking like they had spent the afternoon being preserved in vinegar. Their hands trembled, their eyes darted about like trapped mice, and they appeared to be terrified of the very microphones they were speaking into. They had the tanks, they had the guns, and they had the secret police. But they forgot one crucial detail. They were trying to intimidate a population that had spent 70 years waiting in line for gray sausages. A people who have mastered the art of standing in the snow for 4 hours to buy a single roll of sandpaper-grade toilet paper are not easily frightened by a group of shaking octogenarians in ill-fitting suits. The coup collapsed in 3 days. It was defeated not by a counter-army, but by a man named Boris Yeltsin, standing on a tank and looking like a man who had just finished a very long lunch and was looking for someone to argue with. When the soldiers realized they didn't actually want to shoot the people who were currently yelling at them, the Soviet Union effectively became a ghost. It was still walking around, but everyone could see right through it. Gorbachev, the reluctant liquidator. Mikhail Gorbachev was a peculiar figure in this drama. He was a man who tried to fix a dam by handing out straws to everyone and telling them to drink as fast as they could. He introduced glasnost, which meant speak your mind, and perestroika, which meant fix the plumbing. He wanted to give the people a little bit of freedom, thinking they would use it to politely suggest improvements to the 5-year plan. He failed to realize that freedom is like a leak in a dike. Once you let in a trickle, the whole North Sea is coming through for dinner. You cannot give a man a little bit of liberty any more than you can be a little bit pregnant. Once the Russian people realized they could complain without being sent to a scenic labor camp in the Arctic, they didn't stop at complaining about the grain harvest. They started complaining about the entire management. Gorbachev is the only man in history to lose an empire by being too reasonable. He spent the latter half of 1991 watching his country vanish like a puddle in the July sun. One by one, the Soviet republics, places with names that sound like a throat-clearing exercise like Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan, declared they were independent and would like their own flags, their own postage stamps, and preferably their own loans from the West. The flag and the final sigh. The climax of this long, slow-motion collapse occurred on Christmas Day. While the West was busy unwrapping neckties and eating fruitcake, the red flag with a hammer and sickle, the symbol that had kept 3 generations of school children hiding under their desks during air raid drills, was lowered from the Kremlin for the last time. It was a remarkably quiet affair. There were no trumpets, no weeping crowds, and no grand speeches about the march of history. The flag came down, a different one went up, and the Soviet Union ceased to exist as a legal entity. It was as if a giant, grumpy uncle who had been living on the sofa for 74 years suddenly stood up, put on his hat, and walked out the door without saying goodbye. I find it fascinating that an empire that spanned 11 time zones and possessed enough nuclear firepower to turn the moon into a glowing marble could be defeated by a lack of decent consumer electronics and a general shortage of pantyhose. It turns out that the proletariat didn't want to lose their chains. They just wanted to trade them for a pair of Levi's. The new map of confusion. The day after the dissolution, the world woke up to a map that looked like someone had dropped a plate of spaghetti on the floor. Where there used to be one big solid block of red, there were now 15 different countries, all of them broke, all of them angry, and most of them still possessing a fair amount of the aforementioned nuclear marble makers. We replaced the Soviet Union with the Commonwealth of Independent States, a name so vague it sounds like a committee for the maintenance of a public park. It was the ultimate 1991 solution. We didn't actually fix the problem, we just changed the stationery and hoped for the best. The verdict of the empty larder. Looking back from my comfortable perch in the afterlife, where, I might add, the heating is much more consistent than it was in Leningrad, I see the fall of the Soviet Union as a great lesson in the stubbornness of human nature. You can tell a man that he is a part of a collective. You can tell him that his labor belongs to the state, and you can tell him that his reward is the glorious future of his grandchildren. But eventually, that man is going to get hungry. And when he looks at his children and sees they have no shoes, and then he looks across the border and sees a man in a silly capitalist country who has 3 pairs of shoes and a car that occasionally starts, the grand experiment is over. 1991 was the year the bill finally came due. The hammer and sickle were lowered not by a conquering army, but by the sheer crushing weight of reality. History, it seems, has a way of balancing its books, even if it takes 70 years to do it. And as the red flag hit the pavement, the digital millennium gave a little cheer, realizing that it now had several 100 million new customers who were desperately in need of a computer and a better way to share pictures of their cats. The world was safer, they said. The threat was gone. But as I watched the new maps being printed, I couldn't help but notice that while the big red scare was over, we had replaced one large, predictable monster with a dozen small, unpredictable ones. We had traded the Cold War for a global yard sale, and I, for one, was curious to see who was going to end up with the porcelain. Chapter 4. The Web is Cast. In the sweltering August of 1891, a man's greatest concern was typically how to keep his collar from wilting, or how to discourage the local fly population from convening a parliament on his forehead. Exactly 1 century later, in August of 1991, the heat was still there, but the flies had been replaced by something far more invasive and significantly more difficult to swat: the World Wide Web. It was during this month that a British fellow named Tim Berners-Lee, a man who apparently found the quiet majesty of the Swiss Alps insufficiently distracting, decided to open the gates to a digital labyrinth that would eventually ensure no human being would ever have to look another human being in the eye again. He called it the World Wide Web. I must tip my hat to the naming convention. It is rare that a man is so honest about his inventions. A web, after all, is a structure designed by a predator to catch a fly, entangle it in sticky threads, and slowly drain its vitality while it hums a frantic, useless tune. And here we are, 30-some-odd years later, still humming. The invisible thread of the hyperlink. Mr. Berners-Lee's primary contribution to the delinquency of the human race was something called the hyperlink. I was told that a hyperlink is a magical blue word that, when poked with a mouse, a plastic puck that does not eat cheese but does require a great deal of scurrying, transports you instantly to another page of information. Imagine, if you will, a library. In my day, a library was a sanctuary of silence and dust, where a man could consult a volume on the migratory habits of the common loon, and, if he were lucky, find a pressed flower left by a bored schoolgirl in 1842. If that man then wished to learn about the geography of Minnesota, where the loon resides, he would have to stand up, walk 3 aisles over, and engage in a brief, whispered skirmish with a librarian who looked as though she had been carved out of a very stern turnip. In the World Wide Web, however, the books are all connected by invisible, ghostly threads. You read the word loon, you click it, and presto, you're now looking at a map of Minnesota. You click the word map, and suddenly you're reading about the history of cartography. You click history, and before you know it, you're studying the lineage of the Habsburgs and wondering why so many of them had such spectacular chins. It is a hypertext system, they tell me. Hyper is a Greek word meaning over or beyond, though in modern American English it mostly refers to a child who has consumed his weight in rock candy. This is an apt description of the web. It is a system that allows the human mind to flit from one shiny object to another with the attention span of a caffeinated sparrow. It is the death of the tangent, because in a world made of hyperlinks, the tangent is the only road available. The Swiss laboratory of infinite distraction. The web was born at a place called CERN, which stands for something French and complicated involving nuclear research. One might think that a group of scientists surrounded by subatomic particles and the fundamental building blocks of the universe would have enough on their plates. Apparently not. They felt that the greatest problem facing humanity was not the mystery of the God particle, but rather the fact that it was too difficult for scientists to share their grocery lists and research papers. Mr. Berners-Lee sat in his office in Switzerland and wrote the code for the first web browser. He called it World Wide Web, which he eventually changed to Nexus, because he realized that people are generally too lazy to type 3 W's in a row without suffering a mild thumb cramp. On August 6, 1991, he posted a short summary of the project on the alt.hypertext news group. This was the digital equivalent of a man standing on a street corner and whispering, "Does anyone want to see a trick?" A few people looked, a few people poked at it, and within a few years the entire world had walked into the spider's parlor and made themselves comfortable on the sticky furniture. The prophecy of the digital feline. I was asked what I thought people would do with this magical library of infinite knowledge. I have lived long enough to know that if you give a man a telescope, the first thing he will do is look for a star. The second thing he will do is try to see into his neighbor's dressing room. The enthusiasts of 91 claimed that the web would bring about a global village. They promised a world where the farmer in Nebraska could exchange philosophical insights with the philosopher in Paris. They envisioned a utopia of enlightened discourse, where ignorance would be cured by the sheer proximity of facts. I, being a man who has spent a great deal of time observing the enlightened public, offered a different prediction. I suggested that if you give the entire human race a way to share anything they want, instantly and for free, they will not use it to discuss the nuances of Plato or the finer points of steam engine repair. No, they will use it to share pictures of their cats. There is something about the feline spirit that resonates with the Internet. A cat is a creature that expects to be worshipped while doing absolutely nothing of value. It is the patron saint of the home page. In 1991, the first cat photo had yet to be uploaded, but the vacuum was there, waiting to be filled. I suspect that in the future, the information superhighway, as the politicians like to call it, will be 80% information and 20% videos of a tabby falling off a bookshelf. the end of the quiet mind. What the web truly represents is the end of the Great Silence. Before August of '91, if a man had a particularly stupid opinion, he was generally limited to shouting it at his dog, or perhaps writing a letter to the editor that would be politely discarded by a sensible clerk. His ignorance was local, it was artisanal, it was contained. The web changed all that. It provided a megaphone to every soul with a modem and a grievance. It allowed the village idiot to find every other village idiot in the world and form a global committee. It turned the library into a bazaar, where the loudest shouter gets the most attention, and the truth is often trampled underfoot by a mob of people looking for a sale on digital trinkets. Mr. Berners-Lee did a noble thing, I suppose. He gave us the web for free. He didn't patent it. He didn't try to own it. He simply set it loose upon the world like a man who opens a birdcage and realizes too late that he has released a swarm of locusts. He intended to connect our minds. He ended up connecting our anxieties. The verdict of the invisible web. As I look at the world of '91 from my vantage point in the great beyond, where the bandwidth is infinite, but the content is mercifully restricted, I see that the web was the final brick in the wall of the 20th century. We had mastered the land with the railroad. We had mastered the sea with the steamer. We had mastered the air with the flying bus. All that was left was to master the noosphere, the realm of thought itself. And so we built a web. We cast it across the continents, through the oceans, and into every parlor and bedroom in the land. We are now a world of connected people who have never been more lonely. We are a world of informed people who can no longer agree on the color of the sky. But at least, thanks to that hot August in Switzerland, if I am ever struck by a sudden, desperate need to see a photograph of a kitten wearing a tiny hat, I can have it in a matter of seconds. Progress, it seems, is a very strange business indeed. It has given us the ability to reach out and touch the other side of the globe, only to realize that when we get there, the other side is just looking at pictures of their own cats and wondering if we have any spare rock candy. 1991, the year the world was caught in a net made of light, and we all decided that being a fly wasn't such a bad career choice after all. Chapter 5. The Linux Manifesto. In my day, if a man offered you something for free, the sensible thing to do was to check your pockets, check your horse's teeth, and then run in the opposite direction as fast as your dignity would allow. We understood the fundamental law of the universe. There is no such thing as a free lunch, and if there were, it would likely consist of day-old cabbage and a lecture on temperance. Ownership was the bedrock of civilization. You owned your land, you owned your house, and if you were a particularly clever author, you spent half your life in a state of perpetual homicidal rage trying to ensure you owned the copyright to your own sentences. The idea that someone would spend hundreds of hours sweating over a complicated piece of machinery, only to hand the blueprints to the first passerby for the sheer joy of the thing, would have been seen as a clear symptom of a softening brain. And yet, in the year of our Lord 1991, a young lad in Finland named Linus Torvalds decided to do exactly that. He sat down at his computer, a machine that, I am told, had less processing power than a modern toaster, but significantly more temperament, and wrote a kernel. Now, in a sensible world, a kernel is something you find in a cob of corn or at the center of a peach. In the digital world, however, the kernel is the ghost in the machine. It is the part of the software that tells the iron and silicon how to behave so that they don't simply sit there looking like a very expensive doorstop. It is the brain, the nervous system, and the irritable foreman of the entire operation. The Helsinki Hobbyist. Mr. Torvalds was a student at the University of Helsinki, a place known for its long winters, its excellent saunas, and its general lack of anything better to do than stare at a glowing screen until your eyes turn into boiled onions. He wanted a version of the Unix operating system for his own computer, but he didn't want to pay the exorbitant fees demanded by the corporate landlords who owned the official versions. In the 90s, software was becoming the new real estate. Companies like Microsoft were building vast, invisible empires where you didn't so much own your computer as you rented the right to use it, provided you followed their rules and paid their tithes. Bill Gates was the new Duke of Silicon, and his windows were the only apertures through which the common man was permitted to view the digital horizon. But Linus, possessing the stubbornness of a Finn and the idealism of the young, decided he would build his own door. On August the 25th, 1991, he sent a message to a news group, the digital equivalent of pinning a note to a tavern door, announcing that he was working on a free operating system. He famously noted that it was just a hobby and won't be big and professional like GNU. I have learned that whenever a man tells you his project is just a hobby, you should prepare for a revolution. It is the professional ventures that usually end in bankruptcy and lawsuits. It is the hobbies that end up changing the shape of the world. The philosophy of the open recipe. This brought about a concept called open source, a term that sounds like a font of eternal youth, but is actually a very clever way of saying, I've left the kitchen door unlocked. Imagine, if you will, that you go to a restaurant and order a spectacular apple pie. You eat it, you enjoy it, and you pay the bill. But if you ask the baker for the recipe so you can make it for your grandmother, the baker calls the police, sues you for intellectual property theft, and ensures you are never allowed to eat pie again. That is proprietary software. Open source, on the other hand, is a system where the baker hands you the pie and says, here's the recipe. Also, if you find a way to make the crust flakier, please write it on the wall so everyone else can do it too. To a man of the 19th century, this sounds like a recipe for starvation. How does the baker buy flour? How does he pay the rent? The answer, it turns out, is that in the digital age, glory and spite are currencies that can be traded for almost anything. The hackers, a term that used to mean someone who was handy with an axe but now refers to someone who is handy with a semicolon, didn't want money. They wanted to prove they were smarter than the fellows at the big corporations. They wanted to scratch an itch. And as it turns out, the human race has a lot of itches. The wisdom of the mob. Linus released his Linux kernel under something called the General Public License. This ensured that no one could ever own it, no one could ever lock it up, and anyone could contribute to it. Suddenly, thousands of people from all over the globe, people who had never met and who likely shared nothing in common except a diet of cold pizza and a hatred for blue screens of death, began working together. They found bugs, which are what you call a mistake when you don't want to admit you were wrong, and fixed them. They added new features. They made the system faster, stronger, and more resilient. It was a bazaar, as one fellow later called it. Instead of a cathedral built by a few elite architects behind closed doors, Linux was a sprawling, chaotic marketplace where everyone brought their own bricks and argued about where the windows should go. I was initially skeptical. I have seen what happens when you let a committee design a horse. You usually end up with a camel that has a grudge and a tendency to spit. But software, it seems, follows a different set of rules. With enough eyes, all bugs are shallow. It turns out that 1,000 bored geniuses working for free can outpace 100 tired employees working for a paycheck. The tuxedoed bird of war. Every great movement needs a symbol, and Linux chose a penguin named Tux. Why a penguin? Mr. Torvalds apparently had a fondness for the birds after being nipped by one at a zoo. It was a master stroke of branding. Microsoft had its stern corporate Windows logo, suggesting a clean, sanitized office where everything was under control. Linux had a fat, slightly dazed-looking flightless bird that appeared to have just finished a very satisfying meal of herring. It was an anti-brand. It said, "We are not here to sell you a dream. We are here to provide you with a very sturdy piece of ice to stand on." By the end of 1991, Linux was still a primitive thing, used only by people who understood how to talk to their computers in a language that sounded like a cat walking across a typewriter. But the seed was planted. The free software movement had its manifesto, its leader, and its mascot. The verdict of the free advice. As I reflect on this from my current position, where the source code of the universe is still somewhat proprietary, though I'm working on a hack for the pearly gates, I realize that Linux was the first great act of digital rebellion. It proved that the electronic frontier didn't have to be carved up into private estates. It suggested that knowledge, once digitized, wants to be free. It wants to be shared, poked, prodded, and improved. In my day, I noted that the only thing free was advice, and it was usually worth exactly what you paid for it. But Linus Torvalds proved me wrong. He gave away a kernel, and the world gave him an empire in return. An empire that nobody owns, but everyone uses. 1991, the year we learned that if you give a man a fish, he eats for a day. But if you give 10,000 hackers the source code for a fish, they will eventually turn it into a shark that can run a web server and navigate a battleship. It was the birth of the community, a world where your neighbor isn't the fellow who lives next door, but the fellow in Australia who just figured out why your computer was making that clicking noise. It was chaotic, it was unpaid, and it was utterly brilliant. And Bill Gates, I imagine, began to have a very strange feeling in his bones, the feeling that someone, somewhere, was giving away his property for free, and there wasn't a single lawyer in the world who could stop them. Chapter 6. The Terminator's Soul. I have always maintained that the stage is a place where one goes to see people pretend to be things they are not, so that we may briefly forget who we actually are. In my day, a special effect consisted of a trapdoor, a puff of sulphurous smoke, or perhaps a very convincing wig. If you wanted a monster, you hired a tall man and sewed him into a suit made of dyed burlap. It was honest work. But by the summer of 1991, the moving pictures had evolved into a form of sorcery that would have had the citizens of Salem reaching for their torches. I found myself sitting in a darkened theater, a cavernous room filled with the smell of artificial butter and the heavy breathing of 300 teenagers, to witness a spectacle titled Terminator 2: Judgment Day. It was a story about a mechanical man sent from a future that hadn't happened yet to save a boy who hadn't grown up yet from another mechanical man who was made of what appeared to be very expensive, very homicidal mercury. If that sentence gives you a headache, you are finally beginning to understand the late 20th century. The Austrian ironclad. The star of this grand production was a gentleman named Arnold Schwarzenegger. Mr. Schwarzenegger is a man of such vast physical proportions that he looks less like a human being and more like a collection of prize-winning hams stuffed into a leather jacket. His acting style is what I would call statuesque, by which I mean he possesses the emotional range of a granite outcropping and a delivery that suggests he is chewing on the script rather than reciting it. However, for the role of a Terminator, a robot designed for the singular purpose of walking through walls and shooting everything that moves, he was a stroke of casting genius. In the first film, he was the villain, a relentless engine of destruction. But in '91, the producers decided that what the world really needed was a kinder, gentler killing machine. They reprogrammed him to be a protector, which is a bit like taking a great white shark, putting a bonnet on it, and asking it to babysit your toddler. The magic of liquid metal. Then there was the antagonist, the T-1000. This fellow was a marvel of the electronic frontier. He was made of mimetic polyalloy, which is a fancy way of saying he could turn into a puddle, a linoleum floor, or a sharp-tongued version of your own mother. I watched, mouth agape, as this man-puddle walked through iron bars and healed his own bullet holes with a shimmer of silver light. In my century, if you shot a man, he stayed shot. In '91, you shoot a man, and he simply looks annoyed and reforms himself like a stubborn bit of mercury on a laboratory table. This was computer-generated imagery, or CGI. It is a process by which thousands of very smart, very tired young people spend months staring at screens to ensure that the laws of physics are thoroughly insulted for our amusement. It occurred to me that we were entering an era where we can no longer trust our own eyes. When a man can turn into a puddle and back again on a giant screen, the line between reality and marketing becomes so thin you could shave with it. The education of a toaster. The heart of the film, if a 2-hour explosion can be said to have a heart, was the relationship between the boy, John Connor, and his pet robot. The boy spent the afternoon teaching the machine how to act like a human. He taught him slang, which in 1991 involved phrases like "hasta la vista, baby," and "eat me." I have seen the progress of human language from the King James Bible to the works of Shakespeare, and I can say that watching a $1-million cybernetic organism struggle to say, "Chill out, dickwad," is perhaps the most concise summary of our species' downward trajectory I have ever witnessed. The boy also commanded the machine not to kill anyone. This led to a series of scenes where the Terminator, instead of simply removing his enemies from the census, would shoot them in the kneecaps. This was presented as a moral victory. It seems that in the 91 version of ethics, maiming for life is the preferred alternative to manslaughter. It's a subtle distinction, but I suppose if you're the one with the shattered patella, you have plenty of time to contemplate the nuance. Why humans cry and why robots don't. The climax of the film took place in a steel mill, a place of fire, molten metal, and a great deal of clanging, which made me feel right at home. After the liquid metal fellow was finally dispatched into a vat of glowing soup, the good Terminator realized he also had to be destroyed to prevent the future apocalypse. As he was lowered into the molten steel, he looked at the weeping boy and uttered the line that sent the theater into a collective sniffle. "I know now why you cry, but it is something I can never do." I sat there in the dark, surrounded by sobbing adolescents, and found myself contemplating the sheer audacity of the moment. Here was a machine, a device made of chips, wires, and Austrian muscle, claiming to have learned the secret of human sorrow. I have often observed that humans cry because they are the only animals capable of perceiving the enormous gap between the way the world is and the way they want it to be. We cry because time is a thief, because love is fragile, and because the grocery store is out of our favorite brand of sardines. It is a biological release valve for the absurdity of existence. To suggest that a machine could understand this by watching a 10-year-old boy throw a tantrum is the height of human vanity. We are so desperate for connection that we are willing to project a soul onto a programmable logic controller. We want the toaster to love us back. The thumbs up of the apocalypse. The Terminator's final act was to give a thumbs up as he sank into the fiery depths. It was a gesture of triumph, of solidarity, of coolness. But as I walked out of the theater into the cool night air of 1991, I couldn't help but feel that we were being sold a very glossy bill of goods. We were cheering for a machine that had been designed to kill us simply because it had learned to use a few catchy catchphrases and promised to only shoot us in the legs. Terminator 2 was a reflection of the year itself, a high-tech, loud, incredibly expensive display of power that tried to convince us it had a heart of gold. We were obsessed with Judgment Day, the idea that our own inventions would eventually rise up and erase us. It is a recurring theme in human history. In the 19th century, we feared the steam engine would steal our souls. In the 20th, we feared the computer would steal our lives. And yet, we keep building them. We keep making the smart bombs and the smart phones and the smart robots. We are a species that is perpetually building its own executioner and then spending the rest of the afternoon trying to teach it how to tell a joke. The verdict of the mechanical soul. As I lit a cigar, a real one, not a digital approximation, I looked at the neon lights of the cinema and realized that the T-800 was the perfect hero for the digital millennium. He was efficient, he was indestructible, and he didn't have any messy emotions of his own to complicate the plot. He was the ultimate user-friendly interface. We don't want a machine that cries. We want a machine that knows why we cry so that it can provide us with a more efficient way to stop doing it. We want a world that is as smooth and shimmering as liquid metal, where every wound heals instantly and every mistake can be corrected by a quick trip through a time portal. But as I puffed on my cigar, I felt a strange kinship with that obsolete model of a machine. Like the Terminator, I am a relic of a previous era, wandering through a future that seems increasingly made of silver puddles and neon green night vision. I don't know why humans cry any more than the machine did, but I do know this. A world where the most emotionally resonant figure is an Austrian robot sinking into a vat of steel is a world that has officially lost its grip on the steering wheel. 1991, the year we decided that the apocalypse would be a blockbuster, and that the only thing standing between us and total annihilation was a piece of hardware with a leather jacket and a really good catchphrase. Hasta la vista, indeed. I think I'll take the stairs. Chapter 7. The Smells Like Teen Spirit Shift. The decade had barely begun, but the hangover from the 1980s was proving to be a monumental headache. For years, the popular music of the American youth had been a colorful, deafening display of peacockery known as hair metal. It was an era where men of questionable vocal talent but unquestionable lung capacity spent more time in front of a mirror with a canister of aerosol hairspray than a debutante preparing for her first cotillion. They wore spandex trousers so tight one could tell what they were thinking about for lunch, and their songs were primarily concerned with the logistics of late-night revelry and the maintenance of their own legendary status. It was a circus that forgot the lions but kept the glitter. But by the autumn of '91, the glitter had turned to grit. The public, it seems, had finally developed a collective allergy to spandex and a sudden, desperate craving for something that didn't smell like a chemical fire in a wig factory. And then, out of the damp, mossy corners of Seattle, a city primarily known for its excessive rainfall and its ability to turn a coffee bean into a religious experience, came a sound that was both a primal scream and a very tired sigh. It was a group called Nirvana, and they released a record titled Nevermind. The title itself was a masterstroke of '91 marketing. It was a shrug set to music. The anthem of the unwashed. I'm told that the lead singer, a lad named Kurt Cobain, was the voice of a generation. If this is true, then the generation in question was one that desperately needed a lozenge and a nap. The music was a curious thing, a loud, quiet, loud dynamic that mimicked the emotional state of a teenager who is whispering about his feelings one moment and screaming because he can't find his car keys the next. The lead single was a ditty called Smells Like Teen Spirit. Now, in my day, Teen Spirit was usually composed of equal parts perspiration, horseplay, and the faint aroma of stolen tobacco. In 1991, however, it was apparently the name of a brand of deodorant. There is a delicious irony in a revolutionary anthem being named after a product designed to keep one's armpits from offending the neighbors. It was a song about apathy that somehow became an obsession. I listened to the lyrics, or at least I tried to. Mr. Cobain sang with a sort of marbles-in-the-mouth growl that made the English language sound like it was being put through a meat grinder. I caught phrases like a mulatto, an albino, a mosquito, my libido, which suggests that either the boy was a brilliant surrealist poet or he was simply reading the inventory of a very strange pawn shop. But the meaning didn't matter. The feeling was what counted. And the feeling was, I am bored, I am miserable, and I'm not entirely sure why. But I'd like to be very loud about it. The lumberjack chic. With the arrival of grunge, a word that implies something you'd find behind a radiator, The fashion of the youth underwent a transformation that would have confused a 19th century logger. Suddenly, the spandex and the hairspray were tossed into the incinerator. In their place came the flannel shirt. Now, I have spent a fair amount of time in the company of men who wear flannel. They are usually men who have a great deal of work to do involving axes, sawmills, or the clearing of brush. They wear flannel because it is warm, sturdy, and hides the dirt of a long day's labor. But the youth of '91 wore flannel as a sort of religious vestment. They wore it oversized, unbuttoned, and preferably with a hole in the elbow. They paired this with ripped jeans, garments that looked as though they had been retrieved from a dog fight. I find it a remarkable testament to the insanity of the human race that we finally reached a point where people would pay a premium price to buy clothes that looked like they had been rejected by a Victorian almshouse. To look poor became the height of wealth. To look unwashed became the peak of sophistication. It was the lumberjack chic, practiced by people who wouldn't know a crosscut saw from a croquet mallet. The luxury of despair. What fascinated me most about this grunge movement was its commitment to a very specific rhythmic form of despair. In my century, if a young person was miserable, it was usually because they had consumption, or because the crops had failed, or because they were being sent to work in a coal mine at the age of 9. Their misery had a tangible, identifiable source. But the youth of '91 possessed the luxury of despair. They were the children of the most prosperous nation in the history of the world, living in an era of unprecedented technological marvels, and yet they were profoundly, aggressively bummed out. They had the World Wide Web, the Super Nintendo, and the smart bomb, but what they really wanted was to sit in a garage and sing about how everything was whatever. Apathy became a style. They practiced the slacker aesthetic, the idea that doing anything with enthusiasm was a sign of low character. To care about something was to be uncool. To try hard was to be a sellout. It was a rebellion against the glossy, hollow success of the '80s, a collective decision to stop pretending that the party was fun and to start focusing on the hangover. The commercialization of the cringe. Of course, as soon as a rebellion becomes popular, the men in suits arrive with their clipboards and their price tags. Within months of Nevermind hitting the top of the charts, the grunge look was being paraded down the runways of Paris. Designers who wouldn't be caught dead in a Seattle basement were selling designer flannel for the price of a small horse. The counterculture was immediately swallowed by the culture and spat back out as a consumer product. You could buy grunge hair wax to make your hair look like you hadn't washed it in a week. You could buy authentic flannel shirts that had been pre-distressed by a machine in a factory. We had managed to turn not caring into a multi-billion-dollar industry. Mr. Cobain, I suspect, found this deeply distressing. He was a man who seemed to genuinely feel the weight of the world and to find himself the face of a marketing campaign for the very things he despised must have been a peculiar kind of hell. He wanted to be a noise. He became a brand. The death of the hairball. While Nirvana was ascending, the hair metal bands were dying out like dinosaurs caught in a sudden frost. Groups with names like Warrant and Poison, names that suggested danger but mostly delivered power ballads about high school sweethearts, found themselves suddenly obsolete. Their posters were ripped down from bedroom walls. Their spandex was consigned to the back of the closet. Their hairspray was used to clear out wasps' nests. The world had moved on. We had traded the party for the protest, even if we weren't entirely sure what we were protesting besides the general quality of existence. We had traded the solo for the sludge, the verdict of the flannel soul. As I look back on 91, I see the smells like teen spirit shift as a necessary, if somewhat damp, correction. The 80s had been a decade of shouting, "Look at me! Look how much I have! Look at my hair!" The 90s began with a grunt and a mumble that said, "Look away, I'm tired, and my shirt has a hole in it." It was a return to a kind of honesty, even if that honesty was wrapped in an oversized plaid shirt and smelled vaguely of unwashed spirit. It reminded us that beneath the fiber optics and the smart bombs, there was still a human heart that felt a bit lost in the machinery of progress. Every generation needs its own way to be misunderstood. In my day, we did it by running away to sea or heading west to prospect for gold. In 1991, they did it by turning up the distortion on their guitars and refusing to comb their hair. The electronic frontier was being settled, the maps were being redrawn, and the Soviet Union was collapsing, but for a few million teenagers in flannel shirts, the most important thing in the world was a three-chord song about a mosquito and a libido. And who am I to judge? I've spent many a fine afternoon doing absolutely nothing and calling it contemplation. The only difference is that I didn't have a drum kit and a distortion pedal to help me explain the silence. 1991, the year we all decided to get grungy. It was a loud, messy, glorious headache, and I wouldn't have traded it for all the spandex in Hollywood, though I still think a good cigar is a much better way to handle apathy than a flannel shirt. It certainly smells better. Chapter 8. The 16-bit Superpower. In the year of our Lord 1876, a man's idea of a high-tech diversion was a game of hoop and stick, or perhaps, if he were feeling particularly decadent, a game of marbles played in the mud. If you were truly wealthy, you might own a mechanical bank that swallowed a penny with a satisfying clink, a spectacle that could occupy a grown man for a better part of an afternoon. But by the autumn of 1991, the American child had abandoned the great outdoors, that vast sun-drenched expanse where one might accidentally encounter exercise, for the siren call of a gray and purple box known as the Super Nintendo Entertainment System. I observed this phenomenon with a mixture of awe and pity. The youth of the nation were engaged in something called a console war. Now, a war, in my traditional understanding, involves generals with spectacular whiskers, maps with red lines, and a great deal of shouting in the mud. This new war was fought in the plush aisles of shopping malls and the Letters to the Editor section of GamePro magazine. It was a duel between two titans of silicon, the established house of Nintendo and the upstart challengers at Sega. And the primary ammunition in this conflict was something called a bit. The great bit speculation. I have spent a significant portion of my life around speculators, men who would bet on the speed of 2 raindrops racing down a window pane or the likelihood of a politician telling the truth on a Tuesday. But I have never seen a speculation as feverish as the one concerning bits. In 1991, the magic number was 16. The previous era had been an 8-bit era, which I'm told refers to the amount of information the machine's brain could process at once. To the layman, an 8-bit world was one where people looked like they were made of stair-steps and moved with the fluidity of a rusty hinge. But 16-bit, that was the promised land. 16 bits meant colors that didn't hurt the eyes. It meant music that sounded less like a telephone having a seizure and more like an actual orchestra, provided that orchestra was made of tiny electronic bees. The console war was essentially a debate over whose bits were bigger, faster, and more blast processed. Sega, with their Genesis machine, claimed they had something called blast processing, a term that sounds like it belongs in a Victorian steel mill. Nintendo countered with Mode 7, a mathematical sorcery that allowed a flat, two-dimensional picture to tilt and rotate, giving the illusion of three-dimensional depth. To a child of 91, Mode 7 was more impressive than the invention of the steam engine. To me, it was simply a very clever way of making one feel seasick without the benefit of a riverboat. The folk hero in overalls, the face of this digital revolution, was a fellow named Mario. I have encountered many heroes in my time, knights in armor, riverboat pilots, even the occasional honest lawyer. But I have never encountered a hero quite like Mario. He is a short, rotund Italian plumber with a mustache that would make a Prussian general weep with envy. His quest, which apparently spans dozens of different worlds, is always the same: to rescue a princess named Peach from a giant fire-breathing turtle who possesses an inexplicable hobby for kidnapping. I sat and watched a young man play Super Mario World. I was struck by the absurdity of the plumbing profession in the digital age. Mario does not spend his time fixing leaks or unclogging drains. No, he spends his time jumping on the heads of sentient mushrooms and flying through the air with the aid of a magical yellow cape. He is a plumber in the same way that I am a quiet, unassuming man who never exaggerates. It is a label of convenience that bears no relation to the facts. And then there was his companion, Yoshi, a small green dinosaur that Mario uses as a beast of burden. Mario's primary method of communication with this creature is to punch it in the back of the head so that it will stick out its tongue and eat a nearby beetle. I have seen many forms of animal husbandry on the frontier, but the dinosaur punch is a new one. It is a world of pure, unadulterated nonsense, presented with such vibrant colors and catchy music that one begins to wonder if the real world is merely a poorly programmed mistake. The twitch of the modern thumb. The most remarkable development of '91, however, was not the graphics or the sound, but the transformation of the human hand. In my day, the thumb was used primarily for hitching a ride, pressing tobacco into a pipe, or occasionally being sucked by a contemplative infant. But the Super Nintendo controller, with its 4 face buttons, 2 shoulder buttons, and a directional pad, has turned the thumb into a precision instrument of twitchy desperation. I watched a lad play F-Zero, a racing game where hover cars travel at speeds that would cause a horse to disintegrate. His thumbs moved with a speed and agility that defied the laws of biology. They were a blur of motion, a frantic dance of muscle and reflex. It occurred to me that we are breeding a new race of people. In the future, the fittest of the species will not be the man who can swing a scythe or steer a ship through a storm. It will be the man whose thumbs can navigate a 16-bit labyrinth at 3 in the morning without developing a cramp. We are evolving toward a state of sedentary athleticism. The boy was sweating, his heart was racing, and his eyes were wide with the 1,000-yard stare of a combat veteran. And yet, he hadn't moved more than 3 inches from his beanbag chair. The Legend of the Golden Cartridge. Toward the end of the year, a new chapter in the Zelda saga was released, A Link to the Past. This was not a mere game, it was an epic poem written in pixels. It involved a young lad in a green tunic, a magical sword, and a parallel world made of shadows. The complexity of it was staggering. In my day, if you wanted an adventure, you went to the territory and got shot at by people who didn't appreciate your presence. In 91, you could have a grand adventure involving time travel, magic flutes, and the saving of the world, all while wearing your pajamas and eating a bowl of sugary cereal. We are making the world smaller, but we are making our imaginary worlds infinitely larger. A boy in 1991 knows the geography of Hyrule better than he knows the geography of his own county. He knows how to defeat a Lionel with a silver arrow, but he likely couldn't tell you how to start a fire without a box of matches. It is a trade-off that I find both fascinating and slightly alarming. We are becoming masters of a world that does not exist. The verdict of the silicon box. As the console war raged on, I realized that the Super Nintendo was more than just a toy. It was the first 16-bit embassy of the digital millennium. It was the moment when the electronic frontier became domestic. It wasn't just in the research labs at CERN or the military bunkers in the desert anymore. It was in the living room, plugged into the television, competing with the evening news for the attention of the family. We are entering an era of interactive narrative, which is a fancy way of saying we are now the authors of our own distractions. Instead of reading a book and wondering what the hero will do next, we are the hero, and we are usually deciding to jump off a cliff just to see what the game over screen looks like. I looked at that gray box with its humming circuits and its glowing light, and I felt a sense of obsolescence. I am a man of words, of ink, of the slow and deliberate pace of a river. This box is a world of light, of speed, and of the frantic clicking of plastic buttons. It is a 16-bit superpower that has conquered the most valuable territory on Earth, the attention of a child. 1991, the year the plumber became a king, the bit became a currency, and the human thumb finally found its true calling. God help us when they reach 32 bits. The human brain might simply evaporate in a cloud of Mode 7 graphics and blast processed adrenaline. But for now, I suppose I'll just sit here and watch the boy try to beat the Star Road. It's certainly more entertaining than watching the Soviet Union dissolve, and the music is considerably better. Chapter 9. The Camcorder's Verdict. In my day, the truth was a remarkably flexible commodity. Much like a cheap accordion, you could stretch it, squeeze it, or play a jaunty tune on it, depending on who was holding the instrument and how much they had paid for the privilege. If a man in a position of authority told you the sun rose in the west, you generally took his word for it, mostly because he was the one with the badge, the gavel, or the largest collection of muskets in the county. Truth was a story told by the winners, usually after a heavy lunch and a thorough scrubbing of the official record. But by the spring of 1991, the monopoly on the truth had been shattered by a plastic brick from Japan. I refer, of course, to the camcorder, a device that allowed the common man to carry a mechanical witness in his rucksack, a witness that possessed no political ambitions, no fear of the dark, and an absolute terrifying inability to forget what it had seen. The home movie menace. Before I discuss the weightier matters of justice, I must first address the sheer psychological horror that the camcorder inflicted upon the American household. For decades, if you visited a neighbor, the worst they could do to you was force you to look at a tray of slides, projections of their vacation to the Grand Canyon that were usually upside down, out of focus, and accompanied by a lecture on the quality of the local mule rental services. In 1991, however, the home movie became a weapon of mass boredom. The camcorder, such as the Sony Handycam, was a marvel of miniaturization, though it still looked like a very large black loaf of bread strapped to a man's face. People began to record everything. I have seen footage of children eating porridge that lasted longer than the Gettysburg Address. I have seen weddings recorded from the perspective of a man who clearly had a vestibular disorder and an unhealthy interest in the floral arrangements. The video age meant that no moment was too trivial to be immortalized on magnetic tape. We were becoming a race of amateur historians, documenting the mundane with a devotion that would have baffled a monk in the Middle Ages. We were so busy recording our lives that we forgot to actually live them. We saw the world through a tiny, flickering viewfinder, convinced that if a birthday party wasn't captured on tape, it hadn't technically happened. The unintentional revolution. However, the true power of the camcorder lay in its ability to be in the wrong place at the exactly right time. On the night of March 3, 1991, a gentleman named George Holliday stepped onto his balcony in Los Angeles to test out his new toy. He wasn't looking for a revolution. He was just looking for something to focus on. What he found was a scene that would forever alter the relationship between the people and the thin blue line. He captured the beating of a man named Rodney King by several members of the Los Angeles Police Department. Now, I have seen the official reports of such incidents in the past. They are masterpieces of creative writing. They use words like subdued, resisted, and necessary force. In the old world, the word of a man with a badge was worth more than the word of a man in the gutter, especially if that man happened to be of a different complexion than the one currently holding the gavel. The official truth was a polished professional fiction that kept the peace by burying the facts. But Mr. Holliday's camera didn't care about the official version. It didn't care about the prestige of the department or the political climate of the city. It simply sat there, whirring away, recording the grainy, shaky, undeniable reality of wood hitting bone. It was the birth of citizen journalism, and the establishment didn't like the look of the new reporter one bit. The witness who does not sweat. When the footage was aired on the evening news, it was as if a ghost had been invited into every living room in America. It was a mechanical verdict. In a courtroom, a witness can be bullied, confused, or bribed. A witness can forget the sequence of events or be made to look unreliable by a lawyer who has spent 20 years learning how to make a saint look like a horse thief. But you cannot cross-examine a magnetic tape. You can play it back, slow it down, and freeze the frame, but the tape will say the exact same thing every single time. It is a witness that does not sweat under the hot lights, does not look at the ceiling when it's lying, and does not have a perspective. It only has pixels. The Rodney King video proved that the electronic frontier wasn't just for video games and cat pictures, it was a mirror. For the first time, the entire nation was forced to look into that mirror and see the parts of itself that it usually preferred to keep in the shadows. The camcorder had turned the public into a jury, and the jury was horrified by the evidence. The end of the gentlemanly secret. This development signaled the end of the gentlemanly secret. Throughout history, those in power have relied on the fact that most things happen in the dark. If a king wanted to dispose of a rival or a sheriff wanted to teach a lesson to a troublemaker, they did it where no one was looking. The truth was whatever survived the encounter. 1991 was the year the lights were permanently turned on. The camcorder meant that any citizen at any moment could become a mechanical spy for the truth. It was a democratization of surveillance. We used to fear Big Brother, the idea that the state was watching us from above. But in 1991, we realized that the real threat to the status quo was Little Brother, the guy across the street with a Panasonic and a full battery. Every person with a camcorder was a potential whistleblower. Every dark alley was a potential film set. We were entering the era of the panopticon, but it was a panopticon where we were all watching each other. Privacy, that quaint 19th century notion of being left alone with one's own thoughts and indiscretions, was beginning to look like a very fragile antique. The verdict of the grainy nightmare. Of course, as the year progressed and the legal gears began to grind toward the eventual trial in Simi Valley, we learned another hard lesson. Even the most undeniable evidence can be interpreted by a mind that is determined not to see it. We learned that while a camera cannot lie, a human being can look at a recording of a lie and call it the truth. But the camcorder's verdict was already out. It had fundamentally changed the way we perceived authority. We no longer trusted the official statement blindly. We waited for the video. If there was no footage, we were skeptical. If there was footage, we were outraged. The camcorder was the ultimate 1991 gadget. It was clunky, it was expensive, and it was primarily used to record boring family dinners. But in its spare time, it was dismantling the foundations of the old world. It was proving that in the digital millennium, the truth wouldn't just set you free. It would be broadcast in standard definition with a timestamp in the corner and a lot of static in the background. The verdict of the lens. As I reflect on this from my current position, where I am thankful that there were no camcorders on the Mississippi in the 1850s, or my official reputation might be even more colorful than it already is, I see the camcorder as a double-edged sword. On one hand, it is a magnificent tool for justice, a way to hold the powerful accountable to the facts. On the other hand, it has turned us into a society of voyeurs, people who would rather record an accident than help the victim, people who believe that an experience is only real if it has been digitized and stored on a shelf. We have traded our memories for footage. A memory is a beautiful, living thing that grows and changes over time. Footage is a cold, dead thing that never changes at all. We are building a world where nothing is ever truly forgotten, which means that nothing is ever truly forgiven. 1991, the year the mechanical witness took the stand. We were given the power to see everything, but as I watched the smoke start to rise from Los Angeles later on, I wondered if we had been given the wisdom to know what to do with what we saw. The truth was on the tape, but the heart was still in the dark. And as any riverboat pilot can tell you, it doesn't matter how well you can see the snags in the water if you've already forgotten how to steer the boat. Chapter 10. The Final Performance. In my day, royalty was a rather straightforward, if somewhat expensive, business. You were either born into it, in which case you spent your life trying to look dignified while your relatives plotted to poison your soup, or you married into it, which usually involved trading a perfectly good personality for a very large hat and a lifelong obligation to wave at strangers. We Americans, of course, spent a great deal of time and gunpowder convincing the world that we had no use for kings, only to spend the next 2 centuries obsessively tracking the bowel movements of every prince and duchess from London to Luxembourg. But by the year of our Lord 1991, the concept of a king had undergone a radical neon-soaked transformation. We no longer looked to the palaces of Europe for our sovereigns. We looked to the stadiums of the world. And the most magnificent monarch of them all was a gentleman who went by the name of Freddie Mercury. He was the King of Queen, a title that sounds like a grammatical error, but was, in fact, the only accurate way to describe a man who could command 70,000 people to clap in unison as if they were a single, giant, rhythmic animal. The voice that shook the river. I have heard many things in my time that were purported to be grand. I have heard the roar of the Atlantic in a gale. I have heard the thunderous whistle of a Mississippi steamboat that could be heard 3 counties away. I have heard the collective groan of a political convention when they realize the free refreshments have run out. But I have never heard anything quite like the voice of Freddie Mercury. It was a voice that didn't just sing, it declared war on silence and usually won by a landslide. It was a 4-octave engine of pure, unadulterated theatrics. He could move from a whisper that would break a heart to a roar that would level a cathedral, and he could do it all while wearing a yellow leather jacket and a mustache that possessed its own zip code. In my century, we were told that a gentleman should be reserved and dignified. Mr. Mercury, on the other hand, was as reserved as a lightning strike in a firework factory. He was a creature of the stage, a dervish of spandex and sequins who understood that if you're going to be a star, you might as well be a supernova. He turned rock and roll into opera, and he turned opera into a street fight. The Bohemian Fever Dream. Take, for example, a little ditty called Bohemian Rhapsody. I listened to this song in '91, and I must confess it made me feel as though I had accidentally consumed a very large quantity of medicinal laudanum. It involves Scaramouche, fandangos, and a gentleman named Beelzebub, who apparently has a devil put aside for the narrator. If I had submitted a manuscript with that level of narrative cohesion to my editor in Hartford, he would have asked me to lie down in a dark room until the fever passed. And yet, it is a masterpiece. It is a song that defies every law of musical gravity. It is ridiculous, it is profound, it is silly, and it is heartbreaking, all within the span of 6 minutes. It is the perfect sonic representation of the human mind after 3 cups of coffee and a late-night encounter with a philosophy textbook, The Invisible Assassin. But then, in the cold November of '91, the music stopped, or at least the man behind it did. On the 23rd of the month, Mr. Mercury issued a brief, polite statement to the world. He informed us that he had been diagnosed with AIDS. It was a disease that had spent the last decade acting as a silent, invisible reaper, stalking the electronic frontier and taking our brightest and our bravest while the world looked the other way, too embarrassed to speak its name. The announcement was a shock. But the real tragedy was the speed of the credits. 24 hours later, he was gone. I find it a cruel and biting irony that a man whose voice could fill a stadium, a man who possessed enough charisma to power the city of London, was silenced by a virus so small it couldn't even be seen under a magnifying glass. Nature has a wicked sense of irony. It allows us to build the smart bomb and the Super Nintendo, but then it reminds us that we are still just fragile collections of water and carbon, vulnerable to a microscopic hitchhiker with a grudge. The stigma and the silence. In 1991, AIDS was not just a medical condition. It was a social verdict. We were a world that could map the stars and split the atom, but we were still terrified of our own neighbors. People spoke about the disease in whispers, as if the very word AIDS were a ghost that could be summoned by saying its name too loudly. There was a great deal of moralizing done by people who had never done anything particularly moral in their lives. They tried to suggest that a virus was a form of judgment, an idea so backwards and superstitious it would have made a medieval monk blush. A virus doesn't have a moral compass. It doesn't care about your politics, your orientation, or how many bits your computer has. It is merely a biological fact, doing what biological facts do, surviving at our expense. Freddie Mercury's death changed the conversation. You cannot ignore a king. When the voice that sang, "We are the champions," is silenced by a virus, even the most stubborn and bigoted minds are forced to look at the reality. His death did more to bring the AIDS crisis into the daylight than 1,000 government pamphlets ever could. It turned the stigma into a tragedy, and tragedy is a language that even politicians can occasionally understand. The final curtain. The world mourned him with a kind of intensity usually reserved for the passing of an actual saint or a particularly beloved brand of soda. We realized that we hadn't just lost a singer, we had lost a bit of our collective joy. Freddie Mercury was the ultimate 1991 figure. He was global, he was high-tech, his music was a marvel of studio sorcery, and he was profoundly individual. In a year where we were all becoming connected by fiber optics and worldwide webs, he was a reminder that the most powerful connection of all is still the one between a man with a microphone and a crowd of people who want to feel alive. He went out with his boots on, as the saying goes. He recorded music until he literally couldn't stand, leaving behind a final performance that was as defiant as it was beautiful. He didn't ask for pity. He asked for us to carry on, as if nothing really matters. The verdict of the stadium. As I reflect on this from my current position, where the choir is considerably more disciplined but significantly less loud than Queen at Wembley, I see Freddie Mercury as a bridge between the old world and the new. He had the soul of a Victorian showman, the voice of a cathedral organ, and the wardrobe of a space traveler. He proved that even in the digital millennium, where everything is recorded on magnetic tape and broadcast in green-tinted night vision, we still need the grand performance. We still need the king. 1991, the year we lost the voice that could hit the back row of the galaxy. It was a year of folding maps and falling flags, but the silence left by Freddie Mercury was the loudest sound of all. He taught us that the show must go on, which is a lovely sentiment, though I suspect the show is a lot quieter and a lot less interesting without a man in a cape telling us that he wants to break free. Death is the only thing that doesn't need a marketing budget, and in 1991 it made its most audacious theft. But as I look down at the electronic frontier, I see that the web he helped cast, unwittingly, is now filled with his voice. He is digital now. He is a collection of bits and pixels that will never catch a virus, never lose a note, and never have to worry about the judgment of the small-minded. The king is dead. Long live the king. And if Beelzebub really does have a devil put aside for him, I'd bet my last cigar that Freddie has already taught the devil how to harmonize. Chapter 11. The Clarence Thomas Hearings. In my day, the Supreme Court of the United States was a place of such profound, sepulchral silence that a man could hear his own hair growing. It was a temple of the law, inhabited by 9 gentlemen, who appeared to have been carved out of particularly grim mahogany, and who spoke only in the dead languages of Latin and precedent. To the average citizen, the court was a mysterious mountain peak, shrouded in the mists of constitutional gravity. You didn't go there for entertainment. You went there to be told, in no uncertain terms, why you were wrong. But by the autumn of 1991, the electronic frontier had officially annexed the judiciary. We had reached a point in our national development where no human drama was considered valid unless it could be chopped into segments, punctuated by advertisements for laundry detergent, and broadcast into the parlors of the nation. And so, the Senate Judiciary Committee decided to turn the confirmation of a Supreme Court justice into the most successful televised soap opera in the history of the Republic. The Nominee and the Noise. The protagonist of this particular melodrama was a gentleman named Clarence Thomas. He had been nominated by President Bush to fill the seat vacated by Thurgood Marshall, a move that was seen as a masterful piece of political chess, or perhaps a very elaborate practical joke, depending on which side of the aisle you frequented. Mr. Thomas was a man of impressive credentials and a voice that possessed the deep, resonant rumble of a steam engine warming up in a train yard. He was presented as a man who had pulled himself up by his own bootstraps, a narrative the American public loves almost as much as it loves a good scandal. Everything was proceeding with the usual boring efficiency of a government auction, until a woman named Anita Hill stepped out of the shadows and into the glare of the television lights. The professor and the polished suit. Anita Hill was a law professor, a profession that, in my experience, involves knowing everything about the rules and very little about the people who break them. She came forward with allegations of sexual harassment from the time she had worked for Mr. Thomas years prior. Now, sexual harassment was a relatively new term in the American lexicon of 91. In the 19th century, we didn't have a name for it. We simply called it being a cad or behaving like a scoundrel, and it was usually settled with a stern letter or a brisk encounter behind the stables. But in the modern era, it had become a matter of federal law and televised testimony. The Senate Judiciary Committee, chaired by a young, remarkably loquacious fellow named Joe Biden, a man who seemed to believe that if he didn't use at least 50 words where 5 would do, the English language might go out of business, found itself in a predicament. They were a group of middle-aged men in very expensive suits trying to adjudicate a he said, she said dispute involving matters that would have made a Victorian lady faint dead away into her tea. The soda can of destiny. The hearings were a masterpiece of the absurdist theater. For 3 days in October, the entire nation stopped its business to listen to a group of senators discuss the contents of a private office with the clinical intensity of a coroner. We were treated to the Coke can incident. I have lived through the Civil War, the Gilded Age, and the invention of the phonograph, but I never expected to see the United States Senate spend several hours debating whether or not a man had commented on a stray pubic hair atop a can of soda. Think of it. Here were the Solons of Washington, the men tasked with the governance of a superpower, the men who held the nuclear codes and the keys to the Treasury, leaning into their microphones to ask for clarification on the specific brand of soft drink involved in a decade-old insult. It was a moment of such profound, breathtaking triviality that it achieved a kind of majestic stupidity. It was the electronic frontier at its most prurient. We had turned the Senate into a keyhole, and the entire world was squinting through it. The high-tech lynching. Mr. Thomas, sensing that his career was being dissolved in a vat of televised gossip, decided to launch a counteroffensive. He famously described the proceedings as a high-tech lynching for uppity blacks who in any way deigned to think for themselves. It was a brilliant rhetorical stroke. It took the focus off the soda can and placed it squarely on the long, dark history of American prejudice. It was a move that left the senators, most of whom were as white as a fresh sheet of stationery and twice as stiff, fumbling for their notes. You could almost see the gears grinding in their heads as they tried to figure out how to cross-examine a man who had just accused them of a metaphorical hanging on national television. The drama was heightened by the he said, she said nature of the evidence. There were no smart bombs here, no camcorder footage, no Mode 7 graphics to tilt the truth into view. There was only the word of a man and the word of a woman, separated by a decade of memory and a vast ocean of political ambition. It was a poker game where everyone was bluffing, and the pot was a lifetime appointment to the highest court in the land. The verdict of the living room. As the hearings reached their climax, the nation was divided. People gathered around their televisions in bars and laundromats and in offices, arguing with a ferocity usually reserved for the World Series. We had become a nation of amateur psychologists and armchair judges. The senators, for their part, seemed mostly interested in protecting their own official reputations. They asked questions that were less about finding the truth and more about ensuring they didn't say anything that would cause them to lose their next election. It was a display of cowardice, dressed up as due process. In the end, the Senate voted to confirm Mr. Thomas by the narrowest of margins, 52 to 48. It was a victory, I suppose, but it was a kind of victory that leaves everyone involved feeling as though they need a very long, very hot bath. Mr. Thomas got the seat, but Ms. Hill got the last word. She became a symbol for a movement that would eventually ensure that no man in an office would ever look at a can of soda the same way again. The verdict of the soap opera. Looking back at the Thomas Hill hearings from the comfortable vantage point of the afterlife, where, I am pleased to report, there are no confirmation hearings and the soda is always chilled, I see it as a pivotal moment in the digital millennium. It was the moment when we realized that news and entertainment had finally completed their long, unholy marriage. We learned that the truth didn't matter nearly as much as the ratings. We learned that if you put enough bright lights and microphones in a room, you can turn even the most serious business of the Republic into a tawdry parlor game. We also learned that the American habit of turning everything into a televised soap opera is a dangerous one. When you turn the law into a show, the people start to treat the law like a script. They stop looking for justice and start looking for a protagonist to root for. They stop weighing the evidence and start weighing the performance. 1991, the year the Supreme Court was dragged into the mud of the marketplace. It was a year of smart machines and free software. But in the halls of the Senate, we were still using the same old dumb human instincts, lust, pride, and the desperate urge to stay on television. As I watched Mr. Thomas take his oath, I couldn't help but think of a story about a man who was accused of stealing a horse. He defended himself so brilliantly, so eloquently, and with such a command of the law that the jury was moved to tears. They acquitted him instantly. As he left the courthouse, his lawyer asked him, "Did you really steal that horse?" The man looked at him and said, "I thought I did, but after hearing my own defense, now I'm not so sure." Clarence Thomas was confirmed, Anita Hill was vindicated by history, and the American public was left with a headache that hasn't quite gone away. But at least we learned one valuable lesson. If you're going to have a conversation about a soda can, make sure there isn't a microphone within 5 miles. It's the only way to keep your electronic frontier from turning into a common garden variety circus. Chapter 12. The Disney Renaissance. In my day, a Renaissance was a term reserved for a specific period in European history when people suddenly decided to stop being so incredibly grim, put on some colorful tights, and start painting things other than the inside of a plague hospital. It was a time of Leonardo, Michelangelo, and a great deal of very uncomfortable marble furniture. One did not expect a Renaissance to occur in a suburb of Los Angeles, led by a group of men who spent their days worrying about the specific shade of yellow on a duck's bill. But by the winter of 1991, the electronic frontier had collided with the old-fashioned inkwell, and the result was a resurrection that would have made the Medici family reach for their checkbooks. After a long period of creative hibernation, during which they produced films that were mostly about confused foxes or dogs who lacked a clear sense of direction, the Walt Disney Company suddenly remembered how to cast a spell. They called it the Disney Renaissance, and its crowning achievement was a little ditty titled Beauty and the Beast. The resurrection of the inkwell. I have always had a great deal of respect for the caricaturist. In my time, a man like Thomas Nast could destroy a politician's career with nothing but a bottle of ink and a well-placed hatchet in a drawing. But animation, the art of making those drawings walk, talk, and occasionally burst into song is a different kind of madness altogether. It is the art of breathing life into a stack of paper, a process that requires the patience of a saint and the eyesight of a hawk. In 1991, however, the electronic frontier had provided the animators with a new set of tools. They were using something called CAPS, a computer system that allowed them to paint the drawings digitally. It was the first time that the machine had been allowed to touch the art in such a profound way. One might fear that the soul would be lost in the circuits, but the opposite occurred. The drawings became more vibrant, more fluid, and, most disturbingly, more emotionally resonant than the actual human actors currently occupying the other channels on the television. I sat in the theater and watched this spectacle. I saw a girl named Belle, who lived in a provincial town, where the inhabitants were so suspicious of her habit of reading books that they sang an entire musical number about her mental stability. I felt an immediate kinship with Belle. Any woman who is considered strange simply because she prefers a library to a village gossip is a woman after my own heart. I've spent half my life trying to explain to people that a book is a much more reliable companion than a neighbor, and much less likely to borrow your lawnmower and never return it. The Beast and the Bureaucrat. Then there was the Beast, a gentleman who had been cursed because he was rude to an old woman who turned out to be an enchantress in disguise. It is a classic tale as old as time, though in my experience, if you are rude to an old woman in Connecticut, she doesn't turn you into a buffalo. She just writes a very pointed letter to the local newspaper. The Beast was a triumph of the animator's art. He was a collection of different animals: the mane of a lion, the brow of a gorilla, the tusks of a wild boar. He was a creature of pure, unadulterated rage, yet he possessed a hidden library that would make a scholar weep. I found the Beast to be the most relatable character of the year. He was grumpy, he hated being told what to do, and he spent most of his time hiding in a castle away from the civilized world. If he had only possessed a decent cigar and a glass of bourbon, we could have been brothers. What struck me most was the comparison between the Beast and the figures I had seen in the previous chapter's Senate hearings. Here was a literal monster, a creature of fur and fangs, who managed to treat a lady with more genuine respect and dignity than the refined gentlemen of the United States Senate were currently affording Anita Hill. It was a strange world where the drawings were teaching us more about manners than the lawmakers. The Singing Teapot and the Domestic Insurrection. One cannot discuss Beauty and the Beast without mentioning the enchanted objects. Because of the curse, the servants of the castle had been turned into various items of household furniture. The butler was a clock, the maitre d' was a candelabra, and the housekeeper was a teapot. Now, I have stayed in many hotels in my time, some of them quite grand, most of them quite wretched, but I have never encountered a staff so eager to provide a dinner theater experience. They performed a musical number titled Be Our Guest, which involved dancing plates, synchronized napkins, and a level of culinary choreography that would have given a French chef a nervous breakdown. It was a marvel of the new map of 1991. We were using computers to create a ballroom scene where the camera swirled around the characters with a fluidity that was previously impossible. We were merging the hand-drawn heart of the past with the digital muscle of the future. The result was a world that felt more real than reality itself. We were no longer just watching a movie. We were being invited into a dream that had been meticulously colored by a machine. The Oscar and the ink-stained glass ceiling. The ultimate proof of the Disney Renaissance came when the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, a group of people who usually treat cartoons with the same condescending fondness one affords a performing dog, nominated Beauty and the Beast for Best Picture. It was the first time an animated film had ever been afforded such an honor. The actors in Hollywood were, I imagine, quite insulted to be told that a collection of ink and paint was more artistically significant than a man in a wig. Crying on cue must have been a bitter pill to swallow. But the public didn't care. We had fallen in love with the drawings. We were living in an era where the real world was becoming increasingly messy. We had wars in the desert, collapsing empires in the east, and soda can scandals in the capital. Is it any wonder that the American public preferred to spend their time in a castle where the tea set sang and the monsters eventually turned into princes? Animation provided a sanctuary from the electronic frontier. It was a place where the rules still made sense, where the villain was always defeated, and where true love could be achieved in 90 minutes, plus time for popcorn. The moral of the furry tale. As the film reached its climax and the beast transformed back into a handsome prince, I felt a twinge of disappointment. The prince was perfectly fine, I suppose, if you like the sort of chin that could crack a walnut. But he was boring. He looked like every other hero in the history of the stage. The beast, on the other hand, had character. He had a temper. He had a history. He had a very large library. I have often found that civilization is a process of sanding down the interesting edges of a person until they are as smooth and forgettable as a river stone. The beast was better as a beast. He didn't have to worry about his taxes, his reputation, or whether his tie was straight. He just had to be himself. The verdict of the Magic Kingdom. Looking back at 1991, I see the Disney Renaissance as a curious paradox. We were using the most advanced technology of the age, the computers of the digital millennium, to tell a story that was hundreds of years old. We were using the future to preserve the past. We were also beginning to realize that the drawings were becoming more influential than the truth. We were entering an era where the image was the reality. If Disney could make us cry for a teapot, what else could the electronic frontier make us feel? What happens to a society when its primary source of moral instruction comes from a corporation with a mouse for a mascot? 1991, the year the inkwell fought back and won. It was the year we decided that a beast with a soul was better than a man without one. It was a year of music, of color, and of the realization that as we move into the digital future, we are going to need more than just bits and hyperlinks to keep us human. We are going to need the tale as old as time, even if it is being delivered to us by a singing clock and a computer-generated ballroom. And if I ever find myself in an enchanted castle, I hope the teapot at least knows how to brew a decent cup of Darjeeling. If she starts singing about the gray stuff, I'm calling a plumber, specifically the one with the mustache and the red hat. He seems to know how to handle these digital hallucinations. Chapter 13. The End of Apartheid. I have long maintained that the human race is the only species of animal that will go to the immense trouble of building a wall, painting it a majestic shade of official authority, and then acting profoundly offended when someone from the other side expresses a desire to see what's for dinner. We are a race of fence builders. We divide the world into us and them, usually based on something as profound as the shape of a nose, the pronunciation of a vowel, or, most curiously of all, the specific amount of pigment the sun has seen fit to deposit in our hide. In the year of our Lord 1885, I observed that the race problem in America was a Gordian knot that we were attempting to untie with a pair of butter knives. But by June of 1991, the eyes of the world were turned toward South Africa, a place where they had spent the better part of the century trying to turn a dictionary into a prison. They called it apartheid, an Afrikaans word meaning apartness. It was a system designed by people who believed that the Creator had run out of ideas after the first 3 shades of beige, and that any further variation was a personal affront to the government. The bureaucracy of the pigment. Now, I have seen some impressive bureaucracies in my time. I have dealt with the United States Post Office and the tax collectors of Hartford, but the South African government of the mid-20th century was in a class of its own. They had a law for everything. They had the Group Areas Act, which told you where you could sleep, the Separate Amenities Act, which told you which park bench was civilized enough for your backside, and the Population Registration Act, which was essentially a botanical guide for humans. Under this last bit of nonsense, every citizen had to be classified as white, black, colored, or Indian. To achieve this, the official experts employed methods that would have made a medieval alchemist look like a man of science. They used the pencil test. If a man's hair was curly enough to hold a pencil in place when he shook his head, he was one thing. If it fell out, he was another. Think of it. The entire legal standing of a human being, his right to vote, his right to own land, his right to be treated with a modicum of decency, depended on the friction between a piece of graphite and a follicle. I have seen men bet their life savings on the turn of a card in a smoky cabin on the Mississippi, but I have never seen a gamble as wretchedly stupid as betting a nation's future on the curl of a man's hair. It was a science of stupidity, practiced by men in starched collars who had forgotten that the soul does not have a texture. The odd couple of reform. By 1991, however, the electronic frontier was beginning to leak through the cracks in the wall. The world had stopped buying South Africa's gold, stopped playing their cricket, and started looking at their official morality with the same suspicion one affords a 3-day-old fish. The president of South Africa was a gentleman named F.W. de Klerk, a man who looked like a very respectable bank manager who had suddenly realized that the vault was empty, and the guards had all gone home to join the revolution. He was a reformer, which is what we call a man who decides to stop adding gasoline to a house fire once the roof has already collapsed. In February of the previous year, he had released a man named Nelson Mandela from prison. Mr. Mandela had spent 27 years in a small stone room for the crime of believing that he was a human being. 27 years. In that time, the world had gone from the hula hoop to the Super Nintendo, and Mr. Mandela had spent it becoming the most patient man on the face of the earth. Watching the two of them navigate the year 1991 was like watching a very tense dance between a man who had just been handed the keys to the kingdom and a man who was desperately trying to remember where he'd left the exit sign. In June, de Klerk finally persuaded his parliament to repeal the Population Registration Act, the final rotting pillar of the apartheid temple. On paper, at least, the science of the pencil was dead. The law versus the heart. The newspapers of the digital millennium were filled with cheers. The end of apartheid was announced with the same finality as the end of the Cold War or the end of the 16-bit console war. We love a clean ending in the 20th century. We like to think that once a man in a wig signs a piece of paper, the universe automatically resets itself to fair. But I have lived long enough, and I have been dead long enough, to know that the law is a very fast hare, while the human heart is a very slow, very stubborn tortoise. You can change a law in an afternoon. You can repeal a statute with the stroke of a pen. You can even tear down a white-only sign and use it for kindling. But the apartness that has been hammered into a man's brain for 40 years does not vanish because of a vote in Pretoria. Justice, it seems, has a set of grinding gears that move with the agonizing pace of a glacier. We think we have reached the destination when we have merely arrived at the starting line. The official ending of apartheid in 1991 was a triumph, yes, but it was also a reminder that we were now entering the much more difficult era of living together. In my day, we freed the slaves with a great deal of blood and a few amendments to the Constitution. We spent the next 100 years wondering why they weren't grateful enough to stay in the shadows and let us pretend that nothing had happened. We changed the law, but we kept the apartness in our manners, in our neighborhoods, and in our hearts. I saw the same shadow hovering over South Africa in '91. The walls were down, but the people were still standing in the same places, looking at each other with a mixture of hope and a very reasonable amount of terror. The Saint of the Long Walk. Nelson Mandela was the only reason the whole thing didn't end in a spectacular homicidal kaboom. He preached reconciliation, a word that most politicians use only when they've run out of ammunition. He understood that if you spend your life looking for revenge, you end up with a very clean record and a very empty house. He was the ultimate 1991 figure, a man of the old world, of dignity, of patience, and of a very long memory, entering a new world of sound bites and global spectacles. He used the electronic frontier to broadcast a message of forgiveness that was so profoundly unmodern, it confused the pundits. They wanted a black versus white narrative. He gave them a human versus inhuman one. The verdict of the slow grinding. As I reflect on this from my comfortable perch, where, I am pleased to note, there are no group areas, and everyone is the same shade of ghostly translucent, I see the repeal of the apartheid laws as the most significant folding of the map in '91. It was the moment the world admitted that the great experiment of separation had failed. We realized that you cannot build a smart world with dumb prejudices. You cannot have a World Wide Web if you are still obsessed with who's allowed to sit on a park bench in Johannesburg. 1991, the year the pencil was finally put back in the desk. It was a year of Beauty and the Beast, of smart bombs, and of the King of Queen. But in South Africa, it was the year we learned that the most difficult frontier of all isn't the electronic one, or the space one, or even the 16-bit one. It is the 6 inches of territory between one man's eyes and another man's soul. We have the technology to see across the globe, but we are still squinting to see the person standing right in front of us. Apartheid died in June of '91, but the apartness is a hardy weed. It'll take a few more generations of gardening before we can walk through that field without tripping over a grudge. But at least, for one glorious moment in June, the sun rose over a world that was a little less classified and a little more human. And if Mr. Mandela could find the patience to wait 27 years for a door to open, I suppose I can find the patience to wait a century or two for the heart to catch up to the ink. Chapter 14. The Pinatubo Shadow. We are a species that takes a great deal of pride in its gadgets. By June of 1991, humanity was feeling particularly smug. We had smart bombs that could find a specific door in a desert. We had a World Wide Web that promised to connect every parlor on the planet. And we had 16-bit video games that allowed a child to command a dinosaur with the twitch of a thumb. We believed, in our collective vanity, that we had finally seized the remote control of the planet. We were the masters of the electronic frontier, and we were quite certain that the universe was impressed by our progress. And then, a mountain in the Philippines named Pinatubo decided it had heard quite enough. The giants sneeze. Mount Pinatubo was what the scientists call a dormant volcano, a term that sounds very peaceful and reassuring, like a sleeping lion or a resting tax collector. It hadn't done a lick of work in over 600 years. It was a lush, green mountain, a quiet neighbor that the local inhabitants had come to trust. But on June 15, 1991, Pinatubo decided that 6 centuries of silence was a sufficient nap. It didn't just erupt. It cleared its throat with the force of several million tons of TNT and spat a plume of ash 25 miles into the sky. I have seen many things that were purported to be monumental. I have seen the Great Wall of China, the expansion of the American rail system, and the sheer unmitigated ego of a New York theater critic. But man's greatest achievements are mere parlor tricks compared to a geological indigestion of this magnitude. The mountain ejected so much rock and ash that it effectively lowered its own height by several hundred feet. It was the ultimate renovation project, completed in a single afternoon without a single permit from the local zoning board. The ash cloud was so vast that it turned high noon into midnight. It buried a pair of American military installations, Clark Air Base and Subic Bay, under a layer of gray soot that looked like the aftermath of a particularly violent chimney sweeping. The Americans, who had spent decades debating the strategic importance of these bases, suddenly found that Mother Nature had a very simple exit strategy of her own. She simply covered the whole thing in dust and told everyone to go home. The stratospheric parasol. But the true genius of Pinatubo was not in the ash it dropped on the ground, but in the invisible mischief it sent into the heavens. Along with the rocks and the soot, the mountain belched 20 million tons of sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere. Now, in a sensible world, sulfur is something associated with matchsticks, rotten eggs, and the more traditional descriptions of the afterlife. But in the stratosphere, it combines with water to form a layer of sulfuric acid aerosols. This layer acted as a global parasol, a vast, shimmering shield that reflected the sun's rays back into space before they could reach the surface. In an era where we were just beginning to fret about global warming, the idea that our own industriousness was turning the planet into a slow cooker, Pinatubo provided a temporary violent solution. It effectively reached out and turned down the global thermostat by about half a degree Celsius. It was a humbling of the digital millennium. We were spending billions of dollars trying to figure out how to control the climate, and a mountain in the Philippines did it for free with a single sneeze. Nature, it seems, still has the biggest remote control, and she doesn't mind changing the channel whenever she feels we're getting a bit too comfortable with the program. The Ghost of 1816. As the global temperatures began to dip in late '91, my mind drifted back to a previous performance by the Geological Theater. I refer to the year 1816, famously known as the year without a summer. In that instance, it was Mount Tambora in Indonesia that had played the lead role. I wasn't there myself. I didn't arrive on this side of the sod until 1835, but the stories were still being told in my youth. It was a year when the frost killed the crops in June, when the snow fell in New England in July, and when the price of oats went so high that even the horses were considering a career in politics just to get a square meal. That volcanic winter had a peculiar effect on the human imagination. It was during that cold, dark summer in Switzerland that a group of writers, including Lord Byron and a young lady named Mary Shelley, found themselves trapped indoors by the relentless rain and the gloom. To pass the time, they decided to tell ghost stories. The result was Frankenstein, a story about a man who creates a monster out of spare parts and then is surprised when the monster doesn't thank him for the favor. I find a delicious irony in this. One volcano gave us the modern horror story. Another, in 1991, gave us a smart war and a liquid metal robot. We are a species that responds to the darkness of the sky by inventing new monsters to keep us company. In 1816, the monster was made of stitches and lightning. In 1991, the monster was made of pixels and Judgment Day, the vivid funeral of the sun. There was, however, one beautiful side effect to the Pinatubo shadow. For months afterward, the sunsets across the planet were transformed into spectacles of such lurid, impossible color that they looked like they had been painted by a drunkard with an unlimited supply of orange and purple ink. The sulfuric acid layer scattered the light in such a way that the sky would turn a deep, bruised violet, followed by a crimson that looked like a fresh wound. People would stand on their porches and gaze at these sunsets, captivated by the beauty of it, entirely forgetting that they were looking at the debris of a catastrophe. It is a classic human trait. We are remarkably good at finding the aesthetic in our own doom. We watch the green-tinted footage of a war and call it high-tech. We watch a volcanic sunset and call it romantic. We have a gift for turning the wrath of God into a very pretty postcard. The verdict of the ash. As the year '91 drew to a close, the Pinatubo shadow remained. The global cooling lasted for nearly 2 years, a lingering reminder of our own insignificance. It occurred to me that while we were busy folding the old maps of the Soviet Union and drawing new ones for the electronic frontier, we were still living on a planet that doesn't care a whit for our borders, our bits, or our smart bombs. A volcano is a nonpartisan actor. It doesn't care if you are a communist or a capitalist. It only cares that you are standing in the path of its laundry. Pinatubo was the ultimate reality check for the digital millennium. It reminded us that for all our superpowers and our hyperlinks, we are still just tenants on a very restless piece of real estate. We have built a world of light and speed, but we are still subject to the whims of the mud and the fire. The humbling of the machine. I saw a news report about the scientists at Clark Air Base trying to protect their expensive computers from the falling ash. They were covering their high-tech marvels with plastic sheets and duct tape, looking remarkably like the people in Israel trying to protect themselves from Scuds with masking tape. There is something profoundly funny about a billion-dollar computer being defeated by a bit of stone dust. The electronic frontier is a fragile thing. It requires electricity, it requires clean rooms, and it requires a world that stays at a predictable temperature. Nature, on the other hand, is a messy, dirty, unpredictable business that hasn't cleaned its room in 4 billion years. 1991, the year the mountain reminded us who is actually in charge. We had the Nintendo War, the web, and the Linux Manifesto. But Mother Nature had the final word. She threw a handful of sulfur into the air and watched us all scramble for our sweaters. It was a year of shadows, the shadow of the past, the shadow of the future, and the literal shadow of a mountain in the Philippines. And as I watched the orange and purple sun sink below the horizon of the great beyond, I couldn't help but admire the show. If you're going to be humbled, you might as well have a spectacular sunset to go with it. Chapter 15. The PowerBook Revolution. In my day, if a man had the misfortune of being a professional writer or a man of business, he was tied to his desk by a tether made of inkwells, heavy stationery, and a mahogany table that required 4 stout men and a mule to move more than 6 inches. If I wanted to take my work to the park, I didn't. I stayed in my study, stared at the wallpaper until the patterns began to move, and waited for the muse or the bill collector to strike. Work was a destination like a church or a prison, and once you stepped out of the front door and into the sunshine, you were, for all intents and purposes, a free man. But in October of 1991, the wizards at the Apple Computer Company decided that man's greatest grievance was his inability to be miserable in multiple locations. They released the PowerBook 100 series, and in doing so, they provided the world with a portable ball and chain that you could carry in a briefcase. The gray slab of modern drudgery. The PowerBook was a marvel of the electronic frontier. It was a computer that had been squashed flat like a very expensive piece of gray luggage that had been caught in a hydraulic press. In '91, they called it a laptop, a name that suggests a certain level of domestic comfort, as if the machine were a purring cat or a favorite quilt. In reality, the PowerBook 100 was a 5-pound slab of plastic and silicon that, after 20 minutes of use, would begin to generate enough heat to slow cook a pheasant. Placing it on your lap was not an act of leisure, it was a test of thermal endurance. It was as if the machine were saying, "I will allow you to write your memoirs under this elm tree, but in exchange, I shall require the top layer of skin from both your thighs." The screen was a passive matrix display, which is a scientific way of saying that If you moved the cursor too quickly, it would disappear into a ghostly fog, leaving you to hunt for it like a man looking for a black cat in a dark cellar during a coal strike. Yet, to the citizens of 91, this was a revelation. For the first time, you could look like a high-tech visionary while sitting on a park bench, even if you were actually just trying to figure out how to open a document without the machine making a sound like a coffee grinder full of gravel. The trackball, a thumb's best friend. The most significant design choice of the PowerBook, one that would have made a Victorian engineer weep with envy, was the placement of the trackball. In the early days of portable computing, most manufacturers treated the mouse as an optional appendage, often clipping it to the side of the machine like a frantic parasite. Apple, however, placed a large gray marble right in the center of the palm rest. This allowed the user to navigate the digital world with a flick of the thumb. As I noted in our discussion of the Super Nintendo, the year 1991 was the great year of the thumb. We were training our digits to be the primary interface with reality. With the trackball, the thumb was promoted from a mere gripper to a navigator. You didn't need a desk, you just needed a sturdy pair of knees and a thumb with a sense of direction. It was a masterpiece of ergonomics, ensuring that a man could develop a very specific kind of repetitive strain injury without ever having to leave his armchair. The death of the day off. The marketing for the PowerBook was filled with images of people using their computers in places where no sane person has ever wanted to work. On airplanes, at the beach, in the middle of a forest. They called it freedom. I have seen many versions of freedom in my time. I have seen the abolition of slavery, the opening of the Western territories, and the invention of the revolving door. But the freedom to take your office into a forest is a very peculiar kind of liberty. If I am in a forest, I am there to admire the trees, to listen to the birds, and perhaps to engage in a brief, one-sided conversation with a squirrel. I am emphatically not there to update a spreadsheet or answer a memorandum regarding the quarterly earnings of a shoe polish company. The PowerBook did not set us free. It simply ensured that we could never truly go home. It was the beginning of the portable office, a concept that has turned the entire planet into a workplace. Before 91, when you left the office, your work stayed there, safely locked in a drawer where it couldn't hurt anyone. After 91, your work followed you like a nagging ghost, tucked inside a gray plastic shell. We were told we could work anywhere, but what we heard was that we must work everywhere. The day off was dying, replaced by the working vacation, a term that is as much of a contradiction as civil war or honest politician. The aesthetics of the executive. The PowerBook was also a social signal. In 91, carrying one was a way of telling the world, I am a man of such immense importance that my thoughts must be digitized immediately, even while I am waiting for my laundry to dry. It was the ultimate accessory for the yuppie, a creature of the late 20th century who believed that the value of a man was directly proportional to the number of glowing screens in his possession. The PowerBook 100 was the entry-level model, while the 170 was the executive version, possessing a screen that didn't ghost quite as much, and a price tag that suggested it was made of solid gold rather than recycled milk jugs. I watched a man in a business suit try to use a PowerBook on a train. He was squinting at the screen, his thumb frantically rolling the trackball, his brow furrowed in a look of intense digital concentration. He looked miserable. He was surrounded by a beautiful landscape, green hills, winding rivers, the majesty of the American countryside, and he was staring at a flickering gray box trying to move a tiny arrow. He was a pioneer of the connected age, but he looked more like a man trying to solve a puzzle in a very small, very hot cage. He had the world in his lap, and he couldn't have been more disconnected from it if he'd been wearing a blindfold and earplugs. The verdict of the portable machine. As I reflect on the PowerBook revolution from my current position, where I am thankful that I can write these words without having to worry about battery life or system bombs, I see it as the final surrender of the human spirit to the machine. We spent centuries trying to escape the drudgery of the factory and the office, only to spend the end of the 20th century figuring out how to carry that drudgery in our pockets. We traded the quiet mind for the portable mind, and we haven't had a moment's peace since. The PowerBook was a brilliant piece of engineering, no doubt. It was sleek, it was innovative, and it paved the way for the smartphones that would eventually turn the human race into a collection of neck-craning zombies. But it also represented a fundamental shift in our priorities. We decided that being productive was more important than being present. We decided that the ability to check in from the top of a mountain was a greater achievement than the ability to simply enjoy the view. A message from the afterlife office. If I could go back to 91 and speak to the engineers at Apple, I would offer them a piece of advice. I would tell them to build a computer that automatically shuts down if it detects the smell of salt air or the sound of a rustling forest. I would tell them to include a feature that, if used on a Sunday afternoon, simply displays the message, "Go outside and talk to a person." But they wouldn't have listened. They were too busy settling the electronic frontier. They were building the future, one trackball at a time. And we, the willing pioneers, were only too happy to strap on our gray plastic packs and march into the sunset, blissfully unaware that the sunset would soon be interrupted by a notification that our battery was at 10% and our boss wanted to know where the report was. 1991, the year the office became a state of mind rather than a state of place. It was the year we learned to carry our burdens with us, and we called it progress. But as any man who has ever carried a 5-pound PowerBook through a busy airport can tell you, progress is a very heavy business, and it's usually looking for a place to plug in. Chapter 16. The Silence of the Lambs. In my day, if you wished to encounter a man-eater, you generally had to travel to the furthest reaches of the South Seas, or perhaps engage in a particularly ill-fated expedition to the polar ice caps, where the rations had run thin and the neighbors began to look like a 3-course dinner. Cannibalism was a grim, desperate business, reserved for those who had run out of both options and groceries. It was certainly not something one associated with a fine education, a love of Italian opera, or a delicate hand with a charcoal sketch. But by the spring of 1991, the American cinema decided to introduce us to a new kind of monster. He didn't wear a hockey mask, he didn't haunt your dreams with razor-fingered gloves, and he didn't require a vat of liquid metal to reform himself. No, this gentleman was a psychiatrist. His name was Dr. Hannibal Lecter, and he was a man of such exquisite refinement that he made the rest of the human race look like a collection of unwashed stable boys who had just discovered the fork. I found myself in the theater once more watching The Silence of the Lambs. It was a psychological thriller, a term that suggests the filmmakers are going to play a game of chess with your sanity and then charge you $7 for the privilege. The Sophisticated Butcher. The star of this grand, macabre production was a British gentleman named Anthony Hopkins. Mr. Hopkins plays the doctor with a stillness that is more terrifying than a thunderclap. He sits in a glass-walled cell, a high-tech cage that looked remarkably like a modern art installation, and waits for the world to come to him. What fascinated me most was the paradox of the man. Dr. Lecter is a gourmet. He appreciates the finer things, the scent of a rare perfume, the nuance of a Bach concerto, and the precise vintage of a Chianti. He is a man who would never dream of using the wrong spoon for his soup, yet he has a penchant for consuming his fellow man with a side of fava beans. It occurred to me that we were being presented with the ultimate 1991 nightmare, the civilized savage. We spent the entire year celebrating our progress, our smart bombs, and our World Wide Web, convinced that our gadgets had finally tamed the beast within. But here was a man who possessed all the polish of the digital millennium and used it to hide a heart of pure prehistoric darkness. He was a reminder that you can teach a wolf to appreciate the opera, but you'd still better keep your fingers away from his mouth. The quid pro quo. The plot involved a young FBI trainee named Clarice Starling, played by Jodie Foster, with a look of perpetual wide-eyed anxiety, who is sent to the doctor to gain his help in catching another murderer. The relationship between the two was a quid pro quo, Latin for, "I'll tell you about my childhood if you tell me why you're so miserable." It was a duel of wits that took place through a sheet of reinforced glass. Starling, with her West Virginia accent and her earnest desire to do good, was the innocent. Lecter, with his predatory gaze and his ability to see into the deepest, darkest corners of her soul, was the oracle. I watched as he dismantled her dignity with the precision of a surgeon. He teased out her memories of screaming lambs and failing fathers, turning her psyche into a plaything. It was a masterpiece of interactive narrative, far more effective than any 16-bit video game. He didn't need Mode 7 graphics to tilt her world. He just needed a well-placed question and a terrifyingly polite smile. The lotion and the well. Then there was the other fellow, the one they were actually trying to catch, a gentleman named Buffalo Bill. Now, if Dr. Lecter was the high-brow monster, Buffalo Bill was the low-brow equivalent. He lived in a basement, possessed a very pampered poodle, and spent his time trying to sew a woman's suit out of his victims. The scene involving the young woman trapped in the well remains one of the most unsettling pieces of theater I have ever witnessed. Bill would stand at the top of the pit and command her to put the lotion in the basket. It was a moment of such mundane domestic horror that it made the grand explosions of the Nintendo war look like a puppet show. There is something about the electronic frontier that makes us obsessed with the private lives of others. We want to see behind the curtain. We want to look into the basement. Buffalo Bill was the dark side of the camcorder age. He was the man who watches you when you don't know you're being watched, the man who turns your private life into his own sick production. The green-tinted climax. The film reached its climax in a scene that featured the return of my old friend, the green-tinted night vision. In the final confrontation, the lights go out, and Buffalo Bill stalks Clarice Starling through his basement using a pair of infrared goggles. Once again, the audience was forced to see the world through the Martian green of 1991 technology. We were right there with the predator, seeing what he saw, feeling the thrill of the hunt. It was a stroke of cinematic genius. It tied the horror of the basement to the horror of the desert war. It proved that whether we are fighting for democracy in the Middle East or fighting for our lives in a cellar in Ohio, our primary tool is the ability to see in the dark while our enemies are blind. The electronic frontier had provided us with the ultimate advantage, the mechanical eye. The Oscar for the ogre. In a move that mirrored the success of Beauty and the Beast, the Academy eventually awarded The Silence of the Lambs the Big Five Oscars: Best Picture, Director, Actor, Actress, and Screenplay. It was the first horror movie to ever win the top prize. The public's appetite for darkness was apparently insatiable. We were bored with the party of the 80s. We were bored with the apathy of the grunge movement. We wanted to be truly, deeply terrified. We wanted a monster who could quote Marcus Aurelius while he ate your liver. I find it a curious indictment of the age. We had reached a point where we were so civilized that we found the idea of a cannibalistic psychiatrist to be the height of entertainment. We had sanitized our wars and digitalized our lives, but we still craved the raw, visceral shock of the ancient hunt. We wanted to look into the abyss, as long as there was a comfortable seat and a large bucket of popcorn between us and the edge. The verdict of the refined palate. As the film ended and Dr. Lecter called Clarice from a tropical island, remarking that he was having an old friend for dinner, the theater was filled with a mixture of laughter and shudders. I walked out into the cool night air, feeling a sudden and profound urge to check the locks on my front door. I looked at the neon lights and the busy streets of 1991, and I realized that we are a very strange species indeed. We build these vast, complex webs of information. We create smart machines and free software. We pretend that we have evolved beyond our primitive instincts. But beneath the surface, we are still the same frightened children who were terrified of the dark. We have just found more sophisticated ways to scare ourselves. We have replaced the ghost story around the campfire with the digital thriller in the theater. Dr. Lecter is the perfect villain for the digital millennium. He is invisible until he chooses to be seen. He is smarter than the system designed to contain him, and he understands our weaknesses better than we understand our strengths. He is the kernel of our own darkness, running on the hardware of our souls. A note on etiquette and evisceration. If I have learned anything from The Silence of the Lambs, it is that manners are no guarantee of morality. A man can be perfectly polite, highly educated, and possess a magnificent record collection and still be the sort of person you wouldn't want to meet in a dark alley, or a brightly lit dining room for that matter. In my day, a scoundrel usually looked like a scoundrel. He had a shifty eye, a frayed collar, and a tendency to look at his shoes when he spoke. But in 1991, the scoundrel was the smartest man in the room. He was the one who knew which wine to pair with human flesh. 1991, the year we learned that the silence isn't just about the lambs, it's about the quiet, calculated way we are losing our grip on what it means to be human in an age of machines. We are becoming spectators of our own darkness, watching the green-tinted nightmare on the screen and wondering if the doctor is still on the line. And if you'll excuse me, I think I'll skip the fava beans for dinner. I have a sudden, desperate craving for something simple, something honest, like a piece of dry toast and a very long distance between myself and anyone named Hannibal. Chapter 17. The 50-Year Echo. We are a race of people who believe that if an event has not occurred in a multiple of 10, it has not truly occurred at all. We pay no mind to the 37th anniversary of a great fire, and we would not give a brass farthing for the 63rd commemoration of a glorious revolution. But the moment a 0 appears at the end of the ledger, we suddenly find ourselves seized by a fit of profound remembrance. We put on our most uncomfortable shoes, hire a brass band to play something somber in a minor key, and stand about in the sun until someone gives a speech that is exactly 4 minutes longer than the audience's collective patience. In December of 1991, the 0 in question was a 50. It was the 50th anniversary of the attack on Pearl Harbor, the day when a sleeping giant was supposedly awakened by a swarm of mechanical hornets from the east. Now, as a man who spent a fair portion of his life trying to wake up at a reasonable hour on a steamboat, I can tell you that being woken up by an explosion is the least effective way to start a productive day. But for America, it was the beginning of a 4-year spree of industrial violence that ended with us owning half the world and most of the world's debt. By 1991, we decided it was time to look back at the harbor, though we did so through the peculiar lens of a decade that was currently obsessed with Japanese automobiles and 16-bit video games. The transformation of tragedy into tourism. I have observed that history is merely the process by which a tragedy is slowly bleached by the sun until it becomes tourism. In 1941, Pearl Harbor was a scene of fire, oil, and the kind of chaos that makes a man reconsider his life choices. By 1991, it had become a magnificent vacation destination where one could pay a handsome sum to stand on a floating white monument and look at a sunken battleship through a pair of sunglasses made in Taiwan. The USS Arizona Memorial is a remarkable thing. It sits atop the remains of the ship like a marble shoebox, straddling the grave of over 1,000 men. There is a specific kind of quiet there, the kind of quiet that is constantly being interrupted by the whirring of 1,000 camcorders, my old friends from Chapter 9, and the hushed whispers of people asking where the nearest gift shop is located. I watched the tourists in their Hawaiian shirts, garments that possess a color palette so aggressive they can be seen from the moon, gazing down into the turquoise water. They were looking for the black tears of the Arizona. This is the oil that has been slowly, stubbornly leaking from the ship's fuel tanks for half a century. One drop at a time, it rises to the surface and creates a shimmering rainbow on the water. The scientists say it's an environmental hazard, but the poets say it's the ship's soul refusing to forget. I say it's the only thing in the United States government that has remained consistent, on schedule, and under budget for 50 years. If we could get the Internal Revenue Service to move with the same relentless, predictable persistence as that oil leak, we'd have a surplus that would make a sultan blush. The President and the Greatest Generation. President George H.W. Bush attended the ceremony. Mr. Bush is a man who actually lived the history we were busy commodifying. He was a naval aviator who had been shot down in the Pacific, a feat that is significantly more impressive than anything I ever did on the Mississippi, which mostly involved trying not to hit a log. He stood before the veterans, men who were now in their 70s, wearing caps that listed their ships and medals that they had earned when they were younger and considerably more indestructible. They call them the Greatest Generation. It is a title that implies that every generation since has been a bit of a disappointment, a collection of slackers in flannel shirts who can't even handle a simple global conflict without complaining about the lack of fiber optics. There is a profound pathos in seeing a hero in his twilight. These men had seen the world burn, and now they were worried about their gout and the price of a gallon of milk. They stood on the docks of Honolulu, looking out at the same water where they had once fought for their lives, while behind them a new generation was busy trying to figure out how to get their power books to connect to a hotel phone line. It was a collision of eras that made the head spin. The second invasion. The most delicious irony of the 1991 commemoration was the political climate. In 1941, we were terrified of Japanese planes. In 1991, we were terrified of Japanese balance sheets. The electronic frontier was currently being dominated by the very nation we had spent the 1940s trying to dismantle. We were driving Toyotas, watching Sony televisions, and, as we discussed, spending our nights enslaved to the Super Nintendo. The Zero was no longer a fighter plane. It was the amount of money left in the American manufacturing sector. There was a great deal of Japan bashing in the air. Politicians were making speeches about how we had won the war, but were losing the economic peace. They suggested that the Japanese had simply traded their bayonets for spreadsheets and were now conquering us one microchip at a time. I found this to be a marvelous piece of theater. We were mourning a surprise attack from 50 years ago while standing in line to buy a Japanese-made camcorder so we could record the mourning. We are a nation that loves a villain, but we prefer our villains to provide us with a high-quality warranty and a very sleek user interface. We were remembering the enemy of the past while writing a check to the business partner of the present. It was a masterpiece of cognitive dissonance that would have baffled a philosopher, but made perfect sense to a salesman. The art of the grudge. President Bush, to his credit, used the occasion to call for reconciliation. He noted that the war is over and that the world has changed. He was right, of course, but the human heart loves a grudge like a dog loves a buried bone. We don't necessarily want to eat it. We just want to know exactly where it is so we can go and sniff it whenever we feel bored. Half a century is a long time in the life of a man, but it is a mere blink in the life of a nation. We were trying to balance the scales of memory. How much do we remember of the horror? How much do we forgive of the offense? And most importantly, how do we turn the whole mess into a television special that can be sold to a global audience? In 1991, the answer was to focus on the veterans. By centering the story on the men who were there, we could bypass the messy politics of the present. We could ignore the trade deficits and the console wars and focus on the simple human drama of a 19-year-old sailor in a sinking ship. It was a way of making the past safe for the present. The verdict of the 50-year echo. As I reflect on this from my current position, where the pearls are much more abundant and the harbors are significantly more peaceful, I see the 50-year anniversary as the moment the Second World War officially moved from news to legend. It was the final great gathering of the participants. Within another decade or two, the men in the caps would be gone, and the Arizona would be left alone with her oil leaks and her tourists. We were witnessing the closing of a chapter, the final echoes of a thunderclap that had reshaped the world. We had built a new world of smart bombs and worldwide webs on the ruins of the old one. We had replaced the sleeping giant of American industry with the sleeping giant of American consumerism. We were celebrating our victory in the past to distract ourselves from our confusion in the present. 1991, the year we looked back at the smoke of 41 and realized that the world had become a place where the enemies are invisible, the weapons are digital, and the only thing that remains the same is the ocean. The ocean doesn't care about our anniversaries. It doesn't care about our greatest generations or our economic miracles. It just waits for the next ship to sink and the next drop of oil to rise. And as the sun set over Diamond Head, casting long purple shadows over the memorial, I couldn't help but admire the sheer, stubborn endurance of the human spirit. We have an incredible capacity to survive a catastrophe, wait 50 years, and then go back to the scene of the crime to buy a commemorative T-shirt. It is a funny old world, and as any pilot can tell you, if you spend too much time looking at the wake behind the boat, you're liable to run the bow right into a bridge. The echo of the harbor was loud in 91, but the electronic frontier was louder. We were remembering the War of the Ancestors while preparing for the War of the Bits. And if there is one thing I have learned, it is that a 0 on a screen is much more dangerous than a 0 in the sky, mostly because you can't shoot it down. You can only try to find a way to pay for it. Chapter 18. The Death of Pan Am. In my day, if a man wished to travel from New York to London, he resigned himself to a week of being tossed about by the Atlantic Ocean like a lone crouton in a very large, very angry bowl of soup. He spent his days dodging spray, his nights contemplating the fragility of iron hulls, and his afternoons trying to ignore the fact that the ship's cook appeared to be using his own socks to strain the broth. It was a journey of endurance, a test of character, and a magnificent excuse to wear a heavy wool coat in July. But by the middle of the 20th century, humanity decided that the ocean was too slow and the sky was too empty. A company called Pan American World Airways, known to the common man as Pan Am, decided to turn the stratosphere into a gentleman's club. They didn't just fly planes, they operated clippers, a name stolen from the majestic sailing ships of the 19th century, to give the terrifying act of hurtling through the clouds a veneer of nautical dignity. However, on the 4th of December in 1991, the blue globe finally stopped spinning. The world's most experienced airline folded its wings, packed up its blue and white flight bags, and vanished into the fog of bankruptcy. It was the end of an era, the death of a dream, and the official beginning of the age of the flying bus. The grand hotel of the heavens. To understand the tragedy of Pan Am's demise, one must understand what air travel used to be before it became a form of organized penance. In the Golden Age, a Pan Am cabin was not a collection of plastic chairs and recycled air. It was an aerial parlor. The stewardesses, as they were called before we decided that flight attendant sounded more like a witness in a mid-level accounting trial, were required to possess the poise of a duchess, the patience of a saint, and a level of physical perfection that made the average passenger feel like a sack of unwashed potatoes. They served roast beef from a rolling cart, poured champagne as if it were water, and treated every passenger as if he were a visiting dignitary rather than a man who had just forgotten his toothbrush. In 1991, I watched the footage of the final flights. The pilots wore caps with gold braid that suggested they had just finished defeating a Spanish armada. The logo, that iconic blue globe, was everywhere. It was a symbol of American reach, a sign that the electronic frontier had its own flag. Pan Am was more than an airline. It was a diplomatic entity. If a Pan Am plane landed in a foreign capital, it was as if the United States had sent a very large, very shiny calling card. The luxury of the cloud-capped towers. I have stayed in some of the finest hotels in the world, and I can tell you that the primary ingredient in luxury is space. In the early days of Pan Am, a man could stretch his legs without kicking the person in front of him in the kidneys. He could sit in a lounge, have a conversation with a stranger that didn't involve an apology for an accidental elbow, and perhaps even enjoy a cigar, a practice that I am told is now considered a felony in most modern cabins, which I find to be a grave insult to the spirit of adventure. But the digital millennium has no room for space. It prefers efficiency, a word used by people who want to charge you a premium for the privilege of being miserable. By 1991, the grandeur of Pan Am had been eroded by the harsh reality of the balance sheet. The world was becoming a place where the cost of a ticket was more important than the quality of the journey. The introduction of the Boeing 747, the jumbo jet, was the beginning of the end. It was a magnificent machine, a cathedral with wings, but it required a great many people to fill it. And once you start trying to fill a cathedral, you eventually stop looking for parishioners and start looking for volume. The Clipper became a people mover, and the romance of the clouds began to smell faintly of stale peanuts and desperation. The triple blow of fate. The death of Pan Am in '91 was not a sudden accident. It was a slow-motion catastrophe, delivered in 3 parts. The Lockerbie Echo. In 1988, a Pan Am flight was brought down over Scotland by a bomb. It was a moment of profound horror that shattered the image of the airline as a safe sanctuary. In the electronic frontier, a reputation is a fragile thing, and Pan Am's was suddenly associated with tragedy rather than triumph. The Gulf War squeeze. As I noted in Chapter 1, the Nintendo War made everyone very twitchy about leaving their living rooms. People stopped flying, fuel prices soared like a startled hawk, and the airline industry found itself in a state of financial cardiac arrest. The rise of the flying bus. Competition had arrived in the form of leaner, hungrier airlines that didn't bother with the roast beef or the gold braid. They realized that the modern traveler would happily trade his dignity for a $20 discount. By December of '91, the company was losing millions of dollars a day. It was a giant that had run out of ground to stand on. When the final pardon from Delta Airlines was withdrawn, the blue globe shattered. The final descent. The last flight of Pan Am, Flight 439, flew from Barbados to Miami. I imagine the atmosphere in that cabin was something akin to a wake held at 30,000 feet. The crew, many of whom had spent decades in the service of the Blue Globe, performed their duties with a heartbreaking professionalism. They served the last drinks, folded the last blankets, and checked the last seat belts of an empire. When the plane landed in Miami, the fire trucks gave it a water salute, spraying arcs of water over the fuselage like a liquid guard of honor. It was a beautiful gesture, though I suspect the employees would have preferred a very large check. The lights were turned off, the hangars were locked, and the name Pan Am was sold to the highest bidder, eventually ending up on the side of a railroad company and a few discount carriers that possessed all the glamour of a damp cardboard box. The verdict of the flying bus. As I reflect on the death of Pan Am from my current vantage point, where the baggage claim is mercifully non-existent, I see it as the moment travel became a transaction rather than an experience. We have traded the clipper for the commute. Today, a man prepares for a flight by removing his shoes, surrendering his liquids, and submitting to a level of personal scrutiny usually reserved for a suspected pickpocket. He is then herded into a metal tube where he is allotted a space roughly the size of a tea tray and told to be grateful for the on-time departure. Pan Am represented a world that was still large, still mysterious, and still possessed a sense of occasion. It was an era where we looked up at the sky and saw a destination. Now we look up and see a schedule. The electronic frontier has made the world so small that we can be anywhere in a matter of hours. But in our rush to arrive, we have forgotten how to travel. The epitaph of the globe. I shall miss the blue ball. It was a fine piece of branding, a reminder that we are all living on the same spinning marble. There was something comforting about the idea that no matter where you were, Beirut, Bangkok, or Boston, you could find a counter with that blue logo and someone who would treat you with a modicum of respect. 1991, the year the sky lost its top hat. We replaced the clipper with the carrier, and we replaced the voyage with the connection. It is a more efficient world, I suppose, and certainly a cheaper one. But as I watch the modern traveler huddle in his flannel shirt, clutching his power book and chewing on a single salted peanut, I can't help but think that we'd lost something essential in the trade. We have conquered the air, but we have lost the wind. We have settled the frontier, but we have destroyed the scenery. And as the final Pan Am jet was towed into the shadows of the Miami airport, the long 20th century took one more step toward the exit, leaving us with a world that is much faster, much smaller, and significantly less interested in the quality of the roast beef. Farewell, Pan Am. You were a magnificent nuisance, a beautiful extravagance, and a reminder that if you're going to fall from the sky, you might as well do it with style. Chapter 19. The Boris Yeltsin Moment. It has been my observation throughout a long and occasionally illustrative life that the Russian people possess a soul that is constructed primarily of three ingredients: a profound, bottomless gloom, an extraordinary capacity for enduring things that would kill a mule, and a wardrobe consisting entirely of coats that weigh more than the wearer. Russian history, if you were to sum it up in a single sentence, is generally, and then things got worse. They have spent centuries being governed by men who believe that liberty is a Russian word for a slightly shorter sentence in the salt mines. But in August of 1991, the Russian people decided they had run out of worse to give. They staged a production that would have baffled the finest playwrights of the age, a drama that involved a group of bumbling conspirators, a very large man with very white hair, and a tank that had the misfortune of being turned into a piece of patio furniture. The Gang of Eight's Cabinet of Curiosities. As we discussed in the chapter regarding the fall of the hammer and sickle, the State Committee on the State of Emergency attempted a coup. These Gang of Eight fellows were the last of the old-fashioned communists, men who believed that if you only shouted proletariat loud enough, the world would stop asking why there was no butter. They chose a Monday morning to launch their revolution, presumably because Mondays are already so miserable that nobody would notice a military takeover. They put Mikhail Gorbachev under house arrest in Crimea, a place where people usually go to enjoy the sun, but which Gorbachev spent wondering if he was about to become a permanent part of the local scenery. Then they held a press conference. I have seen many politicians try to lie with a straight face. It is a fundamental part of their trade. But I have never seen a group of conspirators so visibly terrified of their own conspiracy. The leader, a gentleman named Gennady Yanayev, had hands that trembled with such rhythmic intensity that I suspect he could have been used to churn butter in a moderately sized dairy. Every time he spoke about restoring order, his fingers would perform a frantic little dance on the tabletop, telegraphing to the entire world that he was currently wondering where the nearest exit was located. It was a high-tech failure. In the old days, you'd find out about a coup when the cavalry arrived at your front door. In 1991, you found out about it by watching 8 men in bad suits have a collective nervous breakdown on international television. The man on the iron horse. Enter Boris Yeltsin. If Gorbachev was a man of the library, careful, diplomatic, and prone to using 5-syllable words, Yeltsin was a man of the tavern. He was built like a Siberian oak that had been carved into the shape of a bear and then dressed in a suit that was perpetually trying to escape his shoulders. He possessed a voice that sounded like a rock slide and a temperament that suggested he had just finished his 3rd breakfast and was looking for a fight. When the tanks rolled into Moscow to enforce the coup, Yeltsin didn't hide in a basement. He didn't issue a sternly worded memorandum. He simply walked out of the Russian Parliament building, known as the White House, though it lacked the lawn and the soda can scandals of our own, and climbed onto a tank. Now, a tank is a formidable instrument of war. It is designed to crush things, to explode things, and to generally discourage any conversation. It is not designed to be a podium. It is slippery, it is grease-covered, and it has all the ergonomic comforts of a cast-iron stove. But Yeltsin stood atop it as if he were a riverboat pilot who had just taken command of the entire Mississippi. He stood there, surrounded by soldiers who were clearly wondering if they were supposed to shoot him or ask for his autograph, and he declared the coup illegal. It was a masterpiece of theatrical defiance. In that moment, he wasn't just a politician. He was a folk hero. He was the embodiment of the Russian spirit, stubborn, loud, and utterly refusy. The power of the immovable crowd. The Gang of Eight expected the people to stay home and be terrified. They forgot that the Russian people had spent 70 years being terrified, and they had finally reached their limit. Thousands of Muscovites flocked to the White House, not with guns, but with their own bodies. They built barricades out of trolleys, benches, and whatever bits of the electronic frontier they could find. I saw footage of a young woman standing in front of a tank, holding a single flower. It is a classic image of revolution, but in '91 it was amplified by the global web and the camcorder verdict. The soldiers inside the tanks were 19-year-old boys who had been told they were going to protect the people. When they realized that protecting the people meant crushing the people under 40 tons of Soviet iron, they decided they'd rather go back to their barracks and have a smoke. The coup evaporated in 72 hours. It wasn't defeated by a counteroffensive. It was defeated by the sheer awkward realization that nobody was listening to the official orders anymore. The Gang of Eight fled. Gorbachev returned, looking very confused and slightly sunburned, and Boris Yeltsin became the de facto king of the ruins. The theater of the individual. What fascinates me about the Yeltsin moment is how it represents the shift toward the individual in the digital millennium. For 70 years, the Soviet Union had been about the collective, the idea that the state was everything and the person was nothing. But in August of '91, a single man on a tank and a crowd of individuals in the rain proved that the collective was just a story we told ourselves to keep from feeling lonely. The tank, which was supposed to be the symbol of state power, became a stage for personal power. It was a smart move in a dumb war. Yeltsin understood that in the age of television, an image of a man standing on a tank is worth more than 1,000 nuclear missiles. He conquered an empire with a bit of gymnastic effort and a very loud speech. However, I must offer a word of caution regarding the man-on-a-tank style of government. It is a magnificent way to start a revolution, but it is a dreadful way to run a country. Standing on a tank is a vertical activity. Governing is a horizontal one. Once the cheering stops and the tank is towed away, you are left with the same old problems. The inflation is still there, the bread lines are still long, and the people who were cheering you on Monday are going to be asking for a raise by Thursday. The verdict of the iron soapbox. As I reflect on this from my current position, where the revolutions are much more polite and usually involve a change in the celestial choir's repertoire, I see Yeltsin as the ultimate 1991 pioneer. He was a man who saw the new map before anyone else. He realized that the old maps were just paper, and that if you were bold enough to stand on the iron, you could redraw the world in your own image. 1991, the year a bear of a man climbed onto a beast of a machine and told the past to go home. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated hope, the kind of hope that usually lasts for about 3 weeks before the reality of the electricity bill sets in. But for those 3 days in August, the world was captivated. We watched the electronic frontier broadcast the death of the grand experiment in real time. We saw that even the most powerful army in the world is helpless against a population that has simply decided to stop being afraid. And as Yeltsin stepped down from the tank, I couldn't help but admire the man's balance. He didn't fall off, he didn't get shot, and he managed to look like a hero while wearing a suit that was clearly designed for a smaller planet. If that isn't the definition of a successful politician, I don't know what is. The coup was over, the empire was dying, and the digital millennium was waiting in the wings, holding a stopwatch and a new set of problems. But at least for one glorious afternoon in Moscow, the rock that we had taught to think the tank was used for nothing more dangerous than a very high-stakes game of King of the Hill. Chapter 20, The New Year of the New Map. In my day, a new year was a relatively predictable affair. It involved a great deal of optimistic resolution-making, which usually lasted until about the 3rd of January. A significant amount of restorative punch and the general understanding that the world on Wednesday would look almost exactly like the world on Tuesday, only with a different digit at the end of the date. If you had a map of the world in 1880, you could be reasonably certain that the same map would serve you well in 1881, unless a particularly ambitious explorer had discovered a new island or a particularly creative border commission had moved a fence post in the night. But as the clock ticked toward midnight on December 31st, 1991, I found myself contemplating a world that had undergone a renovation so thorough, so chaotic, and so utterly irreverent toward tradition that I suspect the great architect himself was checking his blueprints to see if he'd missed a page. We had spent 12 months folding up the old maps of the 20th century and tossing them into the incinerator. In their place, we were being handed a shimmering, flickering digital tapestry that didn't just tell us where we were, it told us who we were supposed to be. The cartographer's nervous breakdown. I have a great deal of sympathy for the mapmakers of '91. For 40-odd years, their job had been remarkably simple. You painted one half of the world a sturdy democratic blue, the other half a menacing revolutionary red, and you spent the rest of the afternoon at the pub. It was a world of east and west, a binary struggle that even a politician could understand. By New Year's Eve of 1991, however, the big red block had dissolved into a collection of 15 different republics with names that sounded like a Scrabble bag had been emptied onto a table. We had Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and a host of other stands that the average American couldn't find with a telescope and a guided tour. We had the Baltic states reclaiming their dignity, and we had the Balkans beginning to tear themselves into pieces with a ferocity that suggested they had been saving up their grudges since the Middle Ages. The map was no longer a settled thing. It was a living, breathing, hemorrhaging entity. If you bought a globe in January, it was a historical artifact by December. We were witnessing the death of the short 20th century, that period from 1914 to 1991, where we tried to solve every human problem with a new ideology and a better machine gun. The ideologies had failed, the machines had become smart, and the people were left standing in the rubble, wondering if the new Commonwealth of Independent States would at least be able to keep the trains running. The coronation of the chip. But the true new map of '91 was not the one made of paper and ink. It was the one made of silicon and light. As I looked back over the year, I realized that the electronic frontier had officially moved into the town square. We had seen the birth of the World Wide Web, a net cast across the globe that promised to make us all neighbors, even if we were neighbors who spent our time shouting at each other from behind a screen. We had seen the Linux Manifesto, proving that a community of strangers could build a world without a king or a price tag. We had seen the Power Book, ensuring that a man's office was no longer a place, but a weight in his bag. We were transitioning from a world of things to a world of information. In my century, wealth was a matter of land, cattle, and gold. In 91, wealth was a matter of bits and bandwidth. We were becoming a race of digital pioneers, settling a wilderness that had no geography, no borders, and apparently no off switch. We were connected, a term that suggests a great deal of intimacy, but mostly means we are all subject to the same surges in the electrical grid. The human inventory of 91. As I puffed on a cigar that was, I am sorry to say, increasingly metaphorical, I ran through the ledger of the souls we had encountered in this remarkable year. We had watched a Terminator try to learn why humans cry, only to realize that the humans themselves weren't entirely sure. We had watched Clarice Starling face a monster who had a refined taste in opera and a very peculiar recipe for liver. We had mourned a king of queen whose voice could shatter the heavens, but was silenced by a virus that couldn't be seen by the eye. We had watched a man climb onto a tank to defend a democracy that was still in its swaddling clothes, and we had watched a camcorder tell the truth that a badge tried to hide. We had seen the Nintendo turn war into a game and a game into a war. It was a year of profound contradictions. We were more connected than ever, yet we were retreating into our own flannel-shirted grunge. We were celebrating the end of apartheid, yet we were obsessed with the high-tech lynching of a Senate hearing. We were building a global village, but we were primarily using it to record our own birthdays and complain about the lack of legroom on a flying bus. The digital millennium arrives. As the final seconds of 1991 ticked away, I felt a sense of vertigo. The long 20th century, the century of the steam engine, the radio, the airplane, and the atomic bomb, was effectively over. The digital millennium had finally arrived, and it was holding a remote control. We were entering an era where reality was becoming a matter of resolution. If a thing wasn't on television, it didn't happen. If it wasn't on the web, it didn't exist. And if it wasn't recorded in 16 bits, it wasn't worth playing. We were trading the quiet mind for the flickering screen. God help us, I thought, as I watched the ball drop in Times Square, a spectacle that was being broadcast to every corner of the planet by the very satellites that had helped us smart bomb the desert. We have the technology to talk to everyone, but do we have anything to say? We have the power to see everything, but do we have the wisdom to understand it? We have a new map, but do we have a destination? The verdict of the new year. 1991 was the year the world decided to start over. We tore down the statues, we burned the old passports, and we plugged our televisions into a global network that promised us everything and delivered us a video of a cat falling off a piano. It was a year of magnificent stupidity and breathtaking brilliance. We proved that we can survive a volcanic eruption that lowers the temperature of the planet, but we still haven't figured out how to survive a conversation with someone who disagrees with our politics. We have smart weapons, but we still have dumb hearts. As I watched the fireworks explode over a world that looked nothing like the one I had left behind on the Mississippi, I felt a strange sense of peace. The electronic frontier is a wild and woolly place full of hackers, hyperlinks, and liquid metal monsters. It is a world of speed, of light, and of the frantic clicking of trackballs. It is a world that I, a man of ink and river water, will never fully understand. But it is a world that is, above all, interesting. And if there is one thing I have learned in my time on both sides of the veil, it is that interesting is the only thing that keeps the human race from boring itself into a premature extinction. So here is to 1991, the year of the folding map and the opening window. Here is to the bits, the flannel, the tanks, and the singing teapots. We are moving into a future where the only thing we can be certain of is that nothing will stay the same for more than a microsecond. The clock has struck 12. The map is new. The screen is glowing. And I, Mark Twain, am going to go find a place where I can have a quiet cigar and wonder if anyone has figured out how to download a decent glass of bourbon yet. Happy New Year, you digital pioneers. Don't forget to save your progress. The 21st century looks like it's going to be a very long game, and I suspect the game over screen is going to be spectacularly high definition. The end. This has been Mark Twain.